Winter doesn't ask permission before it kills. Neither do wolves. Seris Vale learned that truth the hard way, running through snow with 6 heartbeats beneath her ribs and death closing in from every direction. The clans called her cursed. The villages locked their gates. And when she finally collapsed at the border of the Iron Crown, bleeding into frozen earth, the king himself knelt beside her in the storm and asked just one question. How many? Her answer changed everything. 6. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is watching. The first arrow missed Seris by inches. She felt the wind of it kiss her cheek as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her throat like swallowed fire. Behind her, the hunters were closing. She could hear their wolves baying, smell the iron of their blades even through the blizzard. Her hand pressed against her swollen belly. 6 months gone and carrying weight that shouldn't exist. 6 heartbeats where there should be 1. Maybe 2 if the moon had blessed her. But 6? The healers who'd examined her before the exile had gone pale. One had whispered abomination. Another had reached for a knife. She'd run before they could use it. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of frozen earth and hostile skies. 3 weeks of villages slamming doors in her face, of farmers throwing stones, of children pointing and crying monster. The Ashfang clans had declared her anathema. Her own mother had spat at her feet. And her mate, the only wolf who'd ever looked at her like she mattered, had died in a border skirmish before he could claim her fully, before he could give her the protection of his name. Now she was alone, pregnant, hunted. The second arrow hit a tree trunk beside her head. Splinters exploded. She lurched sideways, her feet sliding on ice, and went down hard. Pain lanced through her hip. She tasted blood. Get up, something inside her snarled. Get up or die here. She clawed at frozen bark and dragged herself upright. Her legs shook. Her vision swam. But she kept moving because stopping meant death, and death meant the 6 lives inside her would never draw breath. She didn't know what they were, didn't know if they were cursed or sacred or something the world had never seen. But they were hers. And she'd crawl through hell itself before she let them be stolen. The boundary stones appeared through the storm like ghosts. Ancient markers, each one carved with lunar sigils that predated the clans themselves. She'd heard stories about what lay beyond them, the Iron Crown, the domain of King Vaelor Draven, the Alpha Sovereign who ruled the northern territories with a fist of steel and a reputation for merciless order. They said he'd never lost a battle, said he could break a wolf's will with a single look, said he kept his throne through fear and his borders through blood. Seris didn't care about any of that. She crossed the boundary because the hunters were 10 yards behind her and she had nowhere else to go. The world shifted. It wasn't anything she could see or touch, just a feeling, like passing through a curtain of ice water. The air changed, became heavier, more alive. She stumbled forward another dozen steps, and then her strength gave out completely. She dropped to her knees in the snow, one hand still pressed protectively over her belly, and waited for the killing blow. It didn't come. Instead, she heard shouting. Not the triumphant howls of hunters closing for the kill, but something else. Confusion. Fear. She forced her head up and saw them, the 5 Ashfang warriors who'd been tracking her for days, frozen at the boundary line like they'd hit an invisible wall. The largest one, a scarred brute named Kael, who'd once tried to claim her before her mate had driven him off, pointed a blade at her. "You crossed into Draven's territory," he spat. "You think that saves you? He'll kill you himself once he sees what you're carrying." "Then let him," Seris said through chattering teeth. "At least I'll die warm." Kael's lip curled. "You won't make it a mile. The cold patrol doesn't suffer trespassers." She didn't answer, didn't have the strength. She just knelt there in the snow, watching the hunters watching her, and realized with distant clarity that she was going to die regardless. The only question was whether it happened fast or slow. That's when the storm knelt. She felt it before she saw it. A pressure in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. The wind, which had been howling like a living thing, suddenly dropped to nothing. The snow stopped falling. Even the cold seemed to pull back just slightly, as though making room for something bigger. Silver wolves emerged from the white. They came in silence, massive shapes that moved through the drifts like water flowing uphill. 12 of them, 20, more. Their eyes reflected moonlight that shouldn't exist under storm clouds. Their fur seemed to glow. The hunters broke. Kale shouted something, an order or a curse, but his warriors were already scattering. The silver wolves didn't chase them. They simply formed a circle around Seris, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from their bodies, and waited. Then he came. King Vaelor Draven didn't walk through snow. He conquered it. Each step drove through the drifts like he was hammering claims into the earth itself. He stood maybe 6.5 feet tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested violence as birthright. Scars marked his face, his throat, his hands. He wore winter authority like a second skin, all black leather and silver clasps, with a crown of dark iron sitting on his head like it had been forged there. His eyes were the color of old ice, and they saw everything. He stopped 10 feet from where Seris knelt and studied her with the dispassionate focus of a man evaluating livestock. She waited for him to speak, to condemn her, to order her death. Instead, he did something she never expected. He looked at her belly, and his expression changed. It wasn't softness. Vaelor Draven didn't do soft. But something flickered behind that ice, some recognition or realization that made the air between them go tight. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but beneath it ran an undertone like distant thunder. How many? The question made no sense. Seris stared at him, her mind still fogged with cold and exhaustion, trying to understand what he was asking. How many what? How many hunters? How many weeks pregnant? How many? The king's jaw tightened. How many heartbeats? He said again, and this time there was no mistaking the command in it. Understanding crashed through her. He knew. Somehow, impossible as it was, this stranger who'd never laid eyes on her before knew what she carried. Her throat worked. When she finally spoke, the word came out broken. 6. The world fell silent. Around them, the silver wolves went statue still. The few guards who'd accompanied the king exchanged looks of shock. Even the storm itself seemed to hold its breath. Vaelor stared at her for a long moment. Then he moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and dropped to one knee in the snow beside her. His hand, scarred and calloused, pressed against the frozen earth near her belly. Not touching her, not claiming, just listening. Seris didn't breathe. The king's eyes closed. His head tilted slightly, like he was trying to hear something beyond the range of normal senses. And then, so quietly she almost missed it, he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His eyes opened and locked on hers. 6. He'd heard them, all of them. The impossible truth that had gotten her exiled and hunted and driven to the edge of death. What happened next would be debated in taverns and throne rooms for years to come. Some would call it mercy. Others would call it madness. A few would whisper darker things about prophecies and power and the dangerous gamble of kings who break tradition. But in that moment, kneeling in frozen wilderness with a dying Omega and 6 unborn heirs between them, Vaelor Draven made a choice that would fracture his empire. He stood, turned to his guards. She comes with us. My lord, one of them started. She's mine, Vaelor said, and the word carried the weight of absolute law. She crossed the boundary. She carries 6. By the old codes, that makes her blood-marked. Mine to protect or mine to kill. And I choose protection. He bent and lifted Seris into his arms like she weighed nothing. She tried to protest, tried to find words, but her body had finally reached its limit. The warmth of him, the sudden impossible safety of being carried instead of running, undid the last of her will. The king looked down at her as her eyes started to close. You survived this far, he said. Don't die on me now. It wasn't comfort, it was an order. And somewhere in the darkness, pulling her under, Seris decided to obey. She woke to warmth. Real warmth. Not the fever dream heat of hypothermia, but the solid presence of fire and shelter and blankets that didn't smell like frozen earth. She opened her eyes and found herself staring at a ceiling of black stone veined with silver, high enough to make her feel small, but close enough to feel contained, protected. A palace, she realized. She was inside the palace of the Iron Crown, Memory crashed back. The hunt, the boundary, the king kneeling in snow. She sat up fast, too fast, and pain spiked through her skull. A hand pressed against her shoulder, firm but not rough, pushing her back down. "Easy," a woman's voice said. "You've been out for 2 days. Your body needs rest." Seris turned her head and found herself looking at a healer, older, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. The woman's hands moved over Seris's belly with professional efficiency, checking, measuring, listening. After a long moment, the healer sat back. "6, she said quietly. "Mother Moon preserve us. It's actually 6. Are they?" Seris's voice cracked. "Are they alive?" "For now." The healer's expression was carefully neutral. "But you're malnourished, dehydrated, and carrying weight your body wasn't built for. If you'd lasted another 3 days out there, you would have lost them all." The words hit like a fist. Seris closed her eyes against sudden tears and hated herself for the weakness. She'd survived exile and arrows and winter. She wouldn't break now. "Why did he bring me here?" she asked. The healer stood, gathering her instruments with brisk movements. "You'll have to ask the king that yourself. He's ordered you kept under guard and provided with everything you need, food, warmth, protection. Whether that's mercy or strategy, I couldn't say." She paused at the door and looked back. "But I will tell you this. In 40 years of serving the Iron Crown, I've never seen Vaelor Draven show interest in anything that didn't serve the kingdom's strength. Whatever he sees in you and those children, it's not sentiment." Then she was gone, leaving Seris alone with her thoughts and the 6 small heartbeats that refused to stop fighting. The palace revealed itself slowly, in pieces, like a secret being unwrapped. Seris was confined to a wing of rooms near the healing quarters, but even that small glimpse showed her a world she'd never imagined. Black stone and silver everywhere, polished to a mirror shine. Lunar steel weapons mounted on walls like art. Tapestries depicting wolves and winter and blood-soaked victories. The Iron Crown was built to intimidate, every surface a reminder of power and the price of challenging it. She hated it immediately, not because it was ugly, because it was beautiful in the way predators were beautiful, perfect and deadly and utterly without softness. Guards stood outside her door at all hours. They didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond making sure she didn't leave. Servants brought food 3 times a day, rich heavy meals designed to put weight on her bones, but they set the trays down and fled like she might contaminate them. Only the healers treated her like a person, and even they kept their distance. On the 3rd day, a woman arrived who was neither healer nor servant. She swept into Seris's room like she owned it, dressed in deep blue silk that probably cost more than Seris's entire clan had earned in a year. Her hair was pinned in an elaborate crown of braids, her face painted with subtle cosmetics that made her look ageless. Beautiful, dangerous. "Lady Marin Cray," she introduced herself, though her tone suggested Seris should already know the name. "First advisor to the king and steward of the inner court." She circled Seris like a wolf evaluating prey. "So you're the mystery that has the palace buzzing," Marin said, "the Omega carrying 6. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Survived," Seris said flatly. Marin's smile was sharp. "Oh, you've done more than that. You've walked into the heart of the Iron Crown carrying something that hasn't been seen in 400 years. A silver litter. 6 heirs gestating in one womb. The nobles are divided between calling you sacred and calling you a threat. The king's enemies think you're a weapon he's planning to use. His allies think you're a liability he should eliminate." "And what do you think?" Seris asked. Marin stopped circling and met her eyes. "I think you're a survivor who got very lucky and very unlucky at the same time. Lucky that Vaelor found you before you froze. Unlucky that he brought you here, because now you're a piece on a board you don't understand playing a game you never agreed to join." She leaned closer. "Let me be clear. I serve the king, not you. If protecting you serves the kingdom, I'll make sure you're wrapped in silk and fed honey. If destroying you serves the kingdom, I'll hand you the knife myself. So my advice? Figure out what the king wants from you and give it to him, because the moment you stop being useful, you're dead." She left in a whisper of silk and perfume. Seris sat alone in the too warm room and wondered if she'd traded one form of death for another. Vaelor came on the 5th day. She'd been expecting guards to summon her, to drag her before the throne so he could pronounce judgment in front of the court. Instead, he simply walked into her room at dawn, dismissed the guards with a gesture, and closed the door behind him. In the early light, he looked less like a king and more like what he probably was underneath the crown. A warrior, a killer, a man who'd survived by being harder than everything that tried to break him. He didn't sit, didn't offer pleasantries, just stood near the window and studied her with those ice-pale eyes. "You're stronger," he observed. "The food helps," Seris said. Silence stretched between them. She waited for him to explain why he'd saved her, why he'd brought her here, what he wanted. Instead, he asked a question that caught her completely off guard. "What was his name?" She blinked. "What?" "Your mate, the one who died. What was his name?" The grief hit fresh and sharp. She hadn't said his name aloud since the exile. Hadn't let herself think about him because thinking meant remembering and remembering meant breaking. "Dain," she said quietly. His name was Dain. Vaelor nodded slowly like she'd confirmed something. "The Ashfang clans declared you anathema because you survived him," he said. "Because tradition demands that an unclaimed Omega carrying a dead mate's children should end the pregnancy, or end herself. They couldn't stomach the idea of bloodline continuing without control. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly had his people investigate her history. They called the children cursed," Seris said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "Called me an abomination for carrying something they didn't understand. Dain died before he could claim me fully, before he could give our bond the protection of pack law, so I had no rights, no voice. I was just a vessel carrying monsters." "Are they?" Vaelor asked. "Monsters?" She met his eyes. "They're mine." Something shifted in the king's expression. Not quite approval, but maybe respect. "6 children in one womb," he said. "Do you know what that means? That I'm cursed? That I'm blessed? That I'm some kind of prophecy walking?" She shook her head. "I don't know anything except that they're alive and I'm going to keep them that way." Vaelor moved away from the window and crossed to stand before her. Up close, she could see the scars more clearly. Claw marks across his jaw. A blade wound through his eyebrow. Burns along his throat that suggested he'd survived something that should have killed him. This was a man who understood survival. 400 years ago, he said quietly, there was a silver litter, 7 children born to a queen during a time of war. They grew up to reshape the territories, to break old powers and forge new alliances. History calls them sacred. But the truth is messier. They were threats, living symbols of change that the old order couldn't control. 3 of them were assassinated before they reached adulthood. 2 went mad. The remaining 2 tore the kingdom apart, fighting each other for supremacy. He paused. "Your children are a silver litter, Seris, and if I allow them to be born under my protection, I'm declaring war on 4 centuries of tradition and every noble house that profits from the old ways." Fear crawled up her spine. "So why did you save me?" "Because tradition is a chain," Vaelor said flatly, "and I'm tired of wearing it." He turned away, pacing to the far side of the room. "I've spent 15 years on this throne," he continued. 15 years maintaining order through fear and strength. 15 years watching nobles scheme and warriors plot, and the entire kingdom calcify around laws written by dead men. The Iron Crown is strong, but it's also fragile. One wrong move and it shatters. "Then why risk it?" Seris demanded. "Why risk everything for me?" Vaelor looked at her, and for the first time she saw something beneath the ice. Not warmth, but maybe exhaustion, or loneliness, or the particular kind of rage that came from playing a role so long you forgot what you looked like without the mask. "Because power that can't adapt is just a prettier form of death," he said. "Because I'm tired of ruling a kingdom that's afraid of its own future. And because when I knelt beside you in that snow and heard 6 heartbeats, I realized I had a choice. Preserve the past, or gamble on tomorrow." He moved back toward the door. "You're staying here, under my protection. I'll have the palace rebuilt around you if necessary. But understand this, every noble who sees you sees a threat to their bloodlines. Every warrior who hears about the 6 will wonder if I've lost my mind. And every enemy I've ever made will see you as the perfect weapon to use against me." "So what do I do?" Seris asked. "Survive," Vaelor said. Again. "That seems to be what you're good at." He opened the door, then paused. "And Seris? One more thing, yes? The king's expression was unreadable. If you betray me, I won't hesitate. Crown or no crown, mercy has limits. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of 6 lives and a kingdom that wanted her dead. The palace began attacking her on the 7th day. It started small. A dizzy spell while walking to the bathing chamber. A sudden chill that made her teeth chatter despite the roaring fire. She dismissed it as exhaustion, as her body adjusting to captivity and rich food. Then the bleeding started. She woke in the middle of the night with wetness between her legs and terror in her throat. The healers came running, their faces grim. They worked over her for hours, chanting in old languages and pressing hands glowing with faint silver light against her belly. When dawn came, the eldest healer delivered the news with the expression of someone pronouncing a death sentence. "The palace wards are rejecting the pregnancy," she said. The stones themselves were built with protections against bloodlines deemed threatening to succession. Your children register as exactly that kind of threat. "Can you stop it?" Seris's voice shook. The healer wouldn't meet her eyes. "We can slow it." "Maybe, but unless something changes, you'll lose them within the month." The world tilted. Seris heard the words but couldn't process them. Couldn't accept that after everything she'd survived, after winter and exile and arrows and the impossible mercy of a brutal king, she would lose her children to architecture, to stone, to fear carved into foundations 4 centuries ago. "No," she whispered. The healer's expression was pitying. "I'm sorry, but the wards are ancient, more powerful than anything we can counter. Unless the king orders them torn down." "Then he will," Seris said, and her voice came out fierce despite the tears on her face. "He brought me here. He said he'd protect us. He'll find a way." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. Because Vaelor was a king first, and kings didn't tear down their own palaces for pregnant omegas, no matter what promises they'd made in snow. The whispers started immediately. Seris heard them even through her closed doors. Servants gossiping in corridors, guards muttering to each other during shift changes, nobles gathering in shadowed alcoves to discuss the impossible situation, end the pregnancy, send her away. Protect the kingdom. Let tradition stand. She waited for Vaelor to summon her, to explain, to make a choice. He didn't come. Days passed. The bleeding worsened. The healers grew more desperate, using techniques that made Seris scream and left her shaking with exhaustion. The 6 heartbeats grew weaker. She could feel them faltering, feel her body trying to reject what it had fought so hard to protect. On the 10th day, Lady Maren appeared. She stood at the foot of Seris's bed, immaculate as always, and delivered her message with the efficiency of someone reading a military report. "The king is considering options," she said. "Architects have been consulted. Runesmiths are examining the wards. But you need to understand, tearing down ancestral protections would be seen as an act of madness by the court. Vaelor's enemies are already calling you a distraction, a weakness. If he chooses you over the palace, over tradition, it could fracture the kingdom." "Then what should I do?" Seris asked through gritted teeth. Maren's expression was almost kind. "Prepare to make a sacrifice, one way or another." "What sacrifice?" The advisor moved to the window, looking out over the palace grounds. "There's a choice coming," she said quietly, "between the children and the crown, between what Vaelor wants and what the kingdom needs. And when that choice arrives, you need to be ready to let him go." She turned back. "Because if you love those children, truly love them, you'll understand that the only way they survive is if their protector remains powerful enough to defend them. And power requires sacrifice." Seris stared at her. "You're asking me to give up. I'm asking you to be realistic," Maren corrected. "The palace is 400 years old. The wards were placed by the greatest runesmiths of their age. One pregnant omega, no matter how remarkable, is not worth destroying a kingdom's foundations." "Get out," Seris said. Maren raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Get out!" Seris screamed, and the force of it tore at her throat. "Get out before I show you what a cursed omega is capable of." The advisor studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, cold and knowing. "There it is," she said softly. "The fight. Good. You'll need that in the days ahead." She left without another word. Seris collapsed back against the pillows. her body shaking with rage and fear and the terrible certainty that she was running out of time. That night, she pressed both hands against her belly and whispered to the 6 lives inside. "Hold on," she begged. "Just hold on a little longer, please." The children didn't answer, but somewhere deep in her chest, beneath fear and pain and exhaustion, something else stirred. Not hope. Defiance. She'd survived exile, survived winter, survived the hatred of her own people, and she'd be damned if she let stone kill her children when flesh and blood had failed. Vaelor returned on the 13th day. He came at midnight, entering her room so quietly she didn't hear him until he spoke. "Get up." Seris jerked awake, reaching instinctively for a weapon she didn't have. The king stood silhouetted against moonlight from the window, and in that moment he looked less like a ruler and more like a specter, something carved from shadow and rage. "What's happening?" she demanded. He crossed to her bedside and offered his hand. "Come with me." She didn't take it. "Why?" "Because," Vaelor said, his voice low and dangerous, "I want you to see what conviction costs." He pulled her to her feet when she hesitated, not rough, but utterly without negotiation. She stumbled after him, still wearing only a nightgown, her bare feet cold on stone floors. Guards fell in behind them but kept their distance. The king led her through corridors she'd never seen, deeper into the palace, past tapestries and weapons and portraits of dead rulers who stared down with judgment in their painted eyes. Finally, they emerged onto a balcony overlooking the main courtyard. Below, lit by hundreds of torches, an army of workers swarmed the palace grounds. Masons, architects, runesmiths. They crawled over walls and towers like ants, their hammers ringing out in synchronized rhythm. As Seris watched, an entire wing of the eastern facade shuddered and began to come apart, stone by careful stone. They were dismantling the palace. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Vaelor stood beside her, his expression carved from granite. "Rebuilding," he said. 400 years of fear encoded in stone, and I'm tearing it out. The wards that are killing your children? They're woven into the foundations, the walls, the very bones of this place. So I'm breaking the bones and setting them differently." He turned to face her. This palace was built by a king who was terrified of losing control. He created wards that would attack any bloodline deemed too powerful, too unpredictable, too threatening to the established order. And every king since has maintained those wards because tradition demanded it, because admitting the palace itself was a prison would mean admitting we'd been slaves to fear. Vaelor's jaw tightened. "I won't be that kind of king. I won't rule from a cage built by dead men's paranoia. So I'm tearing it down. All of it. And when I rebuild, it will be a palace that protects the future instead of strangling it." "But the nobles," Seris started, "are already calling me mad," Vaelor finished. "Let them. I've made my choice." He looked back at the workers below, at the systematic destruction of his ancestral home. "You asked me once why I saved you," he said quietly. "Here's the truth. I didn't save you for mercy. I didn't save you for politics. I saved you because when I heard 6 heartbeats in the snow, I realized I'd been waiting my entire reign for a reason to break the chains. You and those children? You're my excuse, my justification, the thing I can point to and say, this is worth more than tradition." He paused. "So yes, I'm gambling. I'm risking throne and legacy and the stability of the entire kingdom, because power that refuses to evolve becomes its own prison. And I'm done living in one." Seris stared at him, at this brutal king who was systematically destroying his own inheritance, and felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest. Not love. Not yet. But recognition. The understanding that came when one survivor recognized another. "You're insane," she said. Vaelor's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Probably. But I'm also right." Below them, another section of wall came down. Stone crashed, workers cheered, and somewhere in the chaos, the ancient wards shuddered and began to break. For the first time since arriving at the Iron Crown, Seris felt the 6 heartbeats steady. Inside her chest, defiance transformed into something fiercer. Hope. The reconstruction took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hammers and chants and stone dust coating everything. 3 weeks of nobles filing formal protests and the king ignoring every single one. 3 weeks of whispered rebellion in corners and open loyalty in others. And through it all, Seris healed. The bleeding stopped. Her strength returned. The children inside her settled, their heartbeats growing stronger as the old wards crumbled and new protections took their place. The healers worked alongside the runesmiths, weaving spells of protection directly into the rebuilt stones, but this time anchored to life rather than control. The palace changed around her. Where before it had been beautiful and cold, now it became something else. Still strong, still magnificent, but no longer quite so merciless. Windows were added where there had been blank walls. Gardens were planted in courtyards that had held only stone. And at the heart of it all, a new birthing chamber was constructed with wards designed not to suppress, but to nurture. Vaelor came every evening to check progress. He never stayed long, never said much beyond reviewing reports and giving orders. But his presence became a constant, a gravity that everything else orbited around. And slowly, carefully, Seris began to understand him. He wasn't kind. Kindness required softness, and the Iron Crown had beaten that out of him years ago. But he was committed. Once he made a decision, he pursued it with absolute conviction. Consequences be damned. It was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. One night, after the workers had left and the palace had fallen into exhausted silence, she found him standing in what would become the birthing chamber. He was alone, running scarred hands over newly laid stone, testing its strength. "You should be sleeping," he said without turning around. "So should you," Seris replied. "Kings don't sleep. We lurk and plot and wait for knives in the dark." She moved to stand beside him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "This choice?" Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. "Every day," he admitted. "Every time a noble files a protest, every time I see the numbers of how much gold this is costing, every time I remember that tradition kept this kingdom stable for 4 centuries, and I've thrown it all away for 6 children who might not survive to adulthood." He turned to look at her. "But regret doesn't matter. I made my choice. Now I live with it." "Why?" Seris asked, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "Why, really?" The king's expression was unreadable. "Because I've spent 15 years being exactly what everyone expected. The brutal king, the iron fist, the ruler who sacrificed everything human to maintain control. And somewhere along the way, I realized I'd become the very thing I hated, a crown that existed only to preserve itself." He gestured at the rebuilt chamber. "You know what the worst part is? Everyone thinks I'm doing this for strategy, for power. They think I'm planning to use your children as weapons or symbols or political tools. They can't conceive that maybe, just maybe, I did it because I was tired of living in a kingdom built on fear." "You're lonely," Seris said, and the words surprised her even as she spoke them. Vaelor's laugh was bitter. "Every king is lonely. It's the price of the crown. But there's a difference between being alone and being hollow. And I was becoming hollow." He met her eyes. "You crossed winter carrying 6 lives while the entire world tried to kill you. You survived because you refused to accept what everyone else said was inevitable. That's not strategy. That's not politics. That's just stubborn, magnificent defiance." He paused. "And I realized if you could do that, maybe I could too. Maybe I could stop accepting inevitability and start fighting for something that actually mattered." Seris felt her throat tighten. "They'll try to kill you for this," she said quietly. Vaelor smiled, and it was the most honest expression she'd ever seen on his face. Let them try. In that moment, standing in a half-built chamber, in a palace being torn apart and remade, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but the foundation for it. The recognition that they were both fighting the same war, just from different directions. Both trying to survive systems designed to crush them. Both refusing to accept that tradition was stronger than will. Seris reached out and took his hand. He stiffened, looked down at their joined fingers like he'd forgotten what human contact felt like. "Thank you," she said simply. Vaelor squeezed her hand once, then let go and stepped back, rebuilding the distance, resuming the role. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The hardest part is still coming." He left her alone in the rebuilt chamber, surrounded by protective wards and moonlight, and the weight of 6 futures pressing against her ribs. and somewhere in the shadows beyond the palace walls, enemies sharpened their knives and prepared to strike. The conspiracy began in whispers and grew teeth in the dark. Lord Malrek Vey had worn patience like armor for 40 years, watching lesser men claim glory while he maintained the old ways in silence. But what Vaelor was doing to the palace, what he was allowing that cursed Omega to do to tradition itself, had finally broken something inside the patriarch's restraint. He gathered his allies in the old wine cellars beneath the palace, where stone was thick enough to muffle voices and old enough to remember when blood determined worth without question. 12 nobles came, some out of conviction, others out of fear, all of them united by the understanding that if Vaelor succeeded in reshaping the Iron Crown around that woman and her impossible children, their world would end. "We're not discussing whether this is madness," Malrek said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "We're discussing how to stop it before the kingdom fractures beyond repair." A younger lord, barely 30 and still drunk on the arrogance of inherited wealth, leaned forward. "The king has made his choice. We can't simply—" "The king has lost his mind," Malrek interrupted, and his tone could have frozen water. "He's tearing down 4 centuries of protection for an Omega who should have died in the snow. He's gambling our stability, our security, our bloodlines on 6 children who may not survive their first winter. That's not leadership, that's obsession." Another voice, this one belonging to Lady Ashrin, a widow who controlled the eastern territories through proxy marriages and carefully cultivated debts. "So what do you propose?" "We can't challenge him directly. Vaelor controls the armies. The guard. Every wolf with teeth answers to him." Malrek smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Then we make him leave," he said simply. "Create a crisis he can't ignore. Border raids, rebellion in the outer provinces, something that requires the king's personal attention and pulls him away from the palace for long enough that we can handle the problem here." "You mean kill her?" someone said. Malrek's expression didn't change. "I mean protect the kingdom. The woman dies. The children die with her, and when Vaelor returns to find his obsession ended, he'll grieve. He'll rage. But ultimately, he'll understand that some prices are too high even for kings to pay." "And if he doesn't?" Lady Ashrin asked. "If he comes back and executes every one of us?" "Then we make sure he doesn't know we were involved," Malrek said. "We use hired claws. Mercenaries with no connection to court. Make it look like her old enemies finally caught up to her. The Ashfang hunters who've been howling at our borders, they'd love another chance at her." He looked around the room, reading faces, measuring commitment. "Understand what I'm offering. A return to stability, to tradition, to a kingdom ruled by laws that have kept us strong for generations. All it costs is 1 woman and 6 children who were never supposed to exist." The nobles exchanged glances. Some looked sick, others looked hungry. All of them looked convinced. Because here's the truth about power that nobody wants to admit. It's not the brutal who survive longest. It's the ones willing to sacrifice others before sacrificing themselves. The ones who understand that kingdoms are built on bodies and kept alive through calculated cruelty. Malrek had learned that lesson young, had built his fortune on it, had maintained his position through 4 different kings by understanding when to bow and when to break. And now, watching Vaelor Draven tear apart everything Malrek's family had spent centuries cultivating, he knew exactly which one this moment required. "When do we move?" someone asked. "Soon," Malrek said. "Within the month. Before she gives birth. Before those children become real enough that even the common people start caring about their fate." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Go home. Act normal. Show the king nothing but loyalty and support. And when the time comes, be ready to grieve appropriately." They filtered out one by one, shadows dispersing into darker shadows. Only Lady Ashrin remained. "You really think this will work?" she asked quietly. "You think we can kill her and survive Vaelor's fury?" Malrek met her eyes. "I think kings are only as strong as the systems supporting them. And right now, Vaelor is fighting the entire weight of tradition. When she dies, that weight will crush his resistance. He'll bend or he'll break. Either way, we win. And if he doesn't bend?" Malrek's smile was cold. "Then we make sure his breaking looks like an accident." Above them, in chambers built to nurture instead of suppress, Seris slept. She dreamed of winter and wolves and a king with ice in his eyes who'd chosen her over everything. She had no idea that choice had already sealed her death. The palace settled into new rhythms over the following weeks. Seris found herself with more freedom than she'd expected. Vaelor had assigned her guards, but they were protection rather than prison. She could walk the rebuilt gardens, explore the new libraries, even attend some of the lesser court functions, though she quickly learned those were exercises in endurance. The nobles watched her like she was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Some made token efforts at civility, offering shallow smiles and emptier compliments. Others didn't bother hiding their contempt. They looked at her belly with expressions ranging from fascination to disgust, and the whispers followed her everywhere. Abomination, corruption. The king's madness made flesh. She endured it because Vaelor had asked her to, because showing weakness now would validate everything they believed about her. So she kept her spine straight and her face neutral and let their hatred slide off like rain on stone. But it wore at her. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal encounter with a cluster of noble wives who'd made pointed comments about bloodline purity while standing close enough for Seris to hear every word, she found herself in the rebuilt sanctuary gardens, sitting on a bench with her hands pressed against her belly, and tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. That's where Merrin found her. The king's advisor moved with her usual grace, settling onto the bench without asking permission. For a long moment, she said nothing, just sat there, watching light play across water features that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago. "They're terrified of you," Merrin finally said. Seris laughed bitterly. "They have a strange way of showing fear." "Fear often looks like cruelty," Merrin replied, "especially in people who've spent their entire lives believing the world operates according to fixed rules. You're proof that the rules can be broken. That makes you more dangerous than any army." She turned to look at Seris directly. "Can I give you advice? You're going to whether I want it or not." Merrin's smile was faint. "Fair. Here it is. Stop trying to win them over. You can't. They've already decided what you are, and nothing you do will change their minds. The only opinion that matters in this palace is Vaelor's, and you already have that." "Do I?" Seris asked. "Or am I just convenient? A useful tool for breaking tradition?" Merrin was quiet for a moment. "I've served the Iron Crown for 20 years, she said. I've watched Vaelor navigate succession crises, border wars, assassination attempts, and political nightmares that would have destroyed lesser rulers. In all that time, I've never seen him gamble on something he wasn't absolutely certain of." She paused. "You think he's using you?" "Maybe he is. But the question you should be asking is whether you care. Because convenient or not, he's the only thing standing between you and a very ugly death. And in this world, protection matters more than sentiment." Seris closed her eyes. "I'm so tired," she admitted. "Tired of being watched. Tired of being judged. Tired of feeling like prey even inside these walls." "Then rest," Merrin said simply. "You're 6 months pregnant with 6 children. Nobody expects you to fight court politics right now." "I expect it of myself." The advisor stood, brushing invisible dust from her gown. "Then you're a fool. Save your strength for the battles that actually matter. And trust me, those are coming." She left Seris alone with the sound of water and the weight of futures pressing against her ribs. That night, for the first time since arriving at the Iron Crown, Seris allowed herself to imagine what came next. Not just survival, not just keeping the children alive, but after. What happened when she gave birth? What happened when 6 children entered a world that already hated them? Would Vaelor still protect them then? Or would his conviction crumble under the reality of raising heirs who represented everything his kingdom feared? She didn't have answers. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath exhaustion and fear, that stubborn core of defiance stirred. Let them hate her. Let them whisper and scheme and plot. She'd survived winter. She'd survived exile. She'd survived the palace itself, trying to kill her children. Whatever came next, she'd survive that too. Vaelor's War Council met 3 times a week in a chamber overlooking the northern territories. Maps covered every surface. Reports piled high on tables. Commanders rotated in and out with news from the borders, most of it grim. The raids had started small. A farm burned, livestock stolen, merchant caravans attacked. Easy to dismiss as random violence, But over the past month, the pattern had grown too obvious to ignore. Someone was orchestrating chaos along the frontier. General Cade, Vaelor's most trusted military advisor and a wolf who'd fought beside him for 15 years, pointed to 3 locations on the map where attacks had clustered. "They're testing us," he said, "seeing how long it takes us to respond, how much force we bring. They want to understand our patterns." Vaelor studied the map with eyes that missed nothing. "This isn't random raiders," he said. "This is strategy. Someone's pulling strings." "The question is who?" another commander offered. "The Ashfang clans. They've been quiet since we took the woman." "Too quiet," Cade agreed. "And they have motive. If they can't have her, maybe they want to bleed us instead." Vaelor's expression was carved from stone. "Or maybe someone closer wants me distracted," he said quietly. The room fell silent. "My lord," Cade started carefully, "if you suspect treachery within the court—" "I always suspect treachery within the court," Vaelor interrupted. "It's why I'm still alive. But suspicion without proof is just paranoia. We need evidence." "Then let me send scouts," Cade offered. "Real hunters, not the ceremonial guards who wouldn't know a conspiracy if it bit them. Someone who can track money and whispers as well as wolves." "Do it," Vaelor ordered, "but quietly. I want to know who's funding these raids and why before we move." He straightened, rolling his shoulders like a fighter preparing for a match. "In the meantime, I need to be visible on the borders. Show strength. Remind everyone that the Iron Crown doesn't tolerate chaos." "You're leaving the palace?" another commander asked, surprise evident. Vaelor's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice. If I stay here while the territories burn, I look weak, distracted. Every enemy I've ever made will see it as an opening." He looked at Cade. "How long?" 2 weeks minimum, the general said. "Maybe 3 if the situation's worse than reports indicate." Vaelor nodded slowly. "Then we leave in 3 days. Prepare the battalions. I want overwhelming force. Not because we need it, but because I want anyone watching to understand that attacking my borders is suicide." The commanders filed out, already planning logistics and routes and supply lines. Cade lingered. "What about the woman?" he asked quietly. "What about her?" Vaelor's tone was carefully neutral, but Cade had known him too long to miss the tension beneath it. "You're leaving her here," the general said, "in a palace full of people who want her dead, while you're weeks away and unable to intervene if something goes wrong." "She has guards," Vaelor said. "Guards can be bought, poisoned, killed." The king turned to face his oldest friend. "What are you suggesting?" "Bring her with us," Cade said. "It's safer than leaving her here." "She's 6 months pregnant with 6 children," Vaelor said flatly. "Traveling that distance in winter would kill her faster than any assassin." "Then you're gambling," Cade said, "betting that whatever loyalty you've bought in this palace is stronger than 4 centuries of tradition." "I'm aware of the stakes," Vaelor said, and his voice carried the kind of ice that ended arguments. But Cade pushed anyway. "Are you? Because from where I stand, you're risking everything for a woman you barely know and children who might not survive their first year. And I have to wonder if that's conviction or something else." "Say it," Vaelor said quietly. The general met his eyes. "I have to wonder if you're thinking clearly, if maybe you've gotten so caught up in breaking tradition that you've forgotten what you're actually protecting." Vaelor moved fast. One moment he was across the room. The next he had Cade by the throat against the wall, not choking him but holding him with enough force to make breathing difficult. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I am thinking more clearly than I have in 15 years, he said. "Every decision I've made, every tradition I've broken, every risk I've taken has been calculated. Deliberate. So don't confuse ruthlessness with madness." He released the general and stepped back. "I brought her here because those children represent something this kingdom desperately needs. Change. Evolution. A future that isn't just endless repetition of the past. And if protecting that future means gambling on loyalty, then I'll make that bet." His expression hardened. "But I'm not stupid. I know there are people in this palace who want her dead. I know leaving gives them an opportunity. So I'm going to make sure they understand what happens if they take it." He moved to the door, then paused. "Gather the full court tomorrow night. Everyone. Nobles, guards, servants. If they breathe air in this palace, I want them in that throne room." "What are you planning?" Cade asked. Vaelor's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Insurance, thick one. The throne room of the Iron Crown could hold 3,000 people when packed tight. That night, it held every single person who lived or worked within the palace walls. They filled the space like water flooding a container, pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously because nobody knew why they'd been summoned. Nobles clustered near the front, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, radiating entitlement and barely concealed irritation. Behind them stood warriors, merchants, craftsmen, servants. The entire hierarchy of the kingdom compressed into one room. Seris stood on a balcony overlooking the throne room, watching the crowd with growing unease. Marin had found her an hour ago and told her to dress formally, but wouldn't explain why. Now, looking at the sea of faces below, she understood she was about to become spectacle again. She hated it. The doors at the far end of the throne room crashed open. Vaelor entered like a storm-given shape. He wore full ceremonial armor, black steel chased with silver, the iron crown sitting on his head like it had been forged there. Behind him came his personal guard, 20 wolves who'd fought beside him through every war and insurrection. They moved in perfect formation, a message of controlled violence. The crowd fell silent. Vaelor climbed the steps to his throne and turned to face his kingdom. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just stood there, letting the weight of his presence press down on every person in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner without him raising it. "I'm leaving in 2 days," he said. "Border raids require my personal attention. I'll be gone for 3 weeks, possibly longer." He paused. "In my absence, this palace will continue to function according to the laws I've established. The laws that have kept this kingdom strong despite every challenge thrown at us." His gaze swept across the nobles. "But I want to be very clear about something. About someone." He gestured, and from the balcony Seris felt her stomach drop as she realized what was coming. "Seris Vale," Vaelor called. "Come down here." She wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but hundreds of eyes were already turning toward her, and she knew refusing the king in front of the entire court would be worse than whatever humiliation awaited below. So she descended the stairs with as much dignity as she could manage, her hand pressed protectively against her belly, feeling like a criminal walking to execution. The crowd parted for her. She felt their stares like physical touch, heard the whispers rising. Look at her, carrying monsters, king's madness. She reached the base of the throne and stopped, unsure whether to kneel or stand. Vaelor made the decision for her by descending the steps and standing beside her instead of above her. The gesture sent shockwaves through the room. "This woman," Vaelor said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "is under my direct protection. She carries 6 children, a silver litter the likes of which hasn't been seen in 400 years. Some of you call that sacred, others call it cursed. I call it the future." He turned to face the crowd fully. "While I'm gone, Seris Vale will remain here, safe, healthy, untouched. And when I return, I expect to find her exactly as I left her." His expression went cold. "If anything happens to her, if she suffers so much as a bruise or a harsh word that crosses into threat, I will hold every person in this room accountable. Nobles, guards, servants, everyone." Lord Malrek, standing near the front of the noble section, spoke up. "My lord, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said," Vaelor interrupted, and his tone could have frozen blood. "You're all complicit. If one of you moves against her, all of you pay. That's how collective responsibility works." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Vaelor let them stew for a moment before raising his hand for silence. "I know what some of you think," he continued. "You think I've lost my mind, that I'm gambling the kingdom's stability on sentiment. Let me disabuse you of that notion right now." He moved back up the steps, putting distance and elevation between himself and the crowd. "I'm not protecting Seris out of kindness. I'm protecting her because those children represent something this kingdom needs more than your comfort, more than your traditions, more than your fear of change." His voice rose. "For 400 years, the Iron Crown has operated on one principle: preserve what exists, maintain order through fear, never innovate, never evolve. Just repeat the same patterns and hope the world doesn't change faster than we can adapt." He slammed a fist against the throne's armrest, and the sound echoed like thunder. "That ends now. I will not rule a kingdom that's afraid of its own future. I will not preserve traditions that exist only to protect the powerful from accountability. and I will not sacrifice innovation at the altar of your paranoia." He leveled his gaze across the room. "So here's your choice. Accept that change is coming. Accept that those 6 children will be born under my protection and raised as heirs to this throne. Accept that the Iron Crown is evolving whether you like it or not." He paused. "Or rebel. Try to kill her while I'm gone. Try to restore your precious tradition through blood and assassination. And when I come back, I will burn every house, every bloodline, every name associated with conspiracy. I will make examples so brutal that people will still be telling horror stories about them 400 years from now." The silence in the throne room was absolute. Vaelor stood above them all, crown glittering in torchlight, every inch the brutal king they'd always known. But now that brutality had a target, a line in the sand. "Choose wisely," he said, "because I'm done pretending there's a middle ground." He dismissed them with a gesture. The crowd filed out in shocked silence, nobles and commoners alike processing what they'd just witnessed. Seris stood frozen at the base of the throne, her heart hammering, unsure whether she'd just been protected or turned into the most obvious target in the kingdom. When the last person had left and the throne room stood empty, Vaelor descended the steps and stopped in front of her. "That was either brilliant or suicidal," she said quietly. "Probably both," he admitted. "You just made me into a test," she said. "A line everyone has to decide whether to cross." "I know," Vaelor said, and for the first time she heard exhaustion in his voice. "But it was the only way. If I'd left you here without making that declaration, they would have killed you quietly and blamed it on complications. This way, at least they have to consider whether their hatred is worth the consequences. And if it is, if they decide collective punishment is worth removing me," Vaelor's expression went hard. "Then I'll keep my promise. And this kingdom will learn what happens when you mistake mercy for weakness." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without looking back, "I meant what I said. About the future. About change. This isn't strategy anymore. It stopped being strategy weeks ago." "Then what is it?" Seris asked. Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. "Conviction," he finally said, "and the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, I can build something better than what I inherited." He left her alone in the empty throne room, surrounded by the weight of crowns and the terrible knowledge that she'd become the focal point of a war neither of them could afford to lose. Above, in darkened corridors, Lord Malrek watched from shadows and smiled. The king departed at dawn 3 days later. Seris watched from her chamber window as battalions assembled in the courtyard below, a river of steel and fur flowing toward the gates. Vaelor sat his warhorse like he'd been born there, all controlled power and absolute command. He didn't look up at her window, didn't acknowledge her presence, just rode out with his armies and disappeared into winter mist. The palace felt different immediately, emptier, colder, like the heart had been cut out of it, and what remained was just architecture pretending at life. Meryn appeared in Seris's doorway an hour later. "The real test starts now," she said without preamble. Seris turned from the window. "How bad will it be?" The advisor's expression was grim. "Vaelor's declaration bought you some protection. Nobody wants to be the first to move because nobody wants to take responsibility for collective punishment. But the longer he's gone, the more that fear will erode. People will start wondering if he actually meant it, if he'd really burn half the kingdom over one woman." She moved into the room. "You need to be smart. Stay visible, but not vulnerable. Accept invitations to minor court functions so they can't claim you're hiding, but never go anywhere without guards. Trust nobody. Not servants, not nobles, not even some of the guards assigned to you." "Why are you helping me?" Seris asked. "You made it very clear when I arrived that you'd kill me yourself if it served the kingdom." Meryn's smile was slight. "Still would," she said. "But right now, keeping you alive serves the kingdom better than killing you. Vaelor staked his entire authority on your survival. If you die, he looks weak, ineffective, and weak kings don't last long." She paused at the door. "Also, for what it's worth, I think you might actually be good for him. He's been dead inside for years, going through the motions of ruling without remembering why it matters. You reminded him. That's valuable. Even if I die?" "Especially if you die," Meryn said, "because then his grief will have purpose." She left before Seris could respond. The days crawled past like wounded animals. Seris attended small gatherings as advised, enduring stilted conversations and measuring every word. She walked gardens under heavy guard, feeling eyes tracking her from windows. She ate meals alone in her chambers and listened to the palace settling into new rhythms around her absence. The children grew stronger. She could feel them moving now, 6 distinct presences fighting for space. The healers assured her everything was progressing normally, but normal felt like a distant concept when you were carrying futures nobody wanted. On the 8th night, something changed. Seris woke to silence so complete it felt like pressure against her ears. No guards talking in the corridor, no servants moving through distant halls. Nothing. She sat up slowly, every instinct screaming danger. That's when she felt it. The first contraction. Not labor. Not yet. But the warning that bodies give when stress pushes them toward edges. Pain lanced through her belly, sharp enough to steal breath. The second contraction followed 30 seconds later. She reached for the bell to summon healers and found the cord had been cut. Terror flooded through her. Seris forced herself out of bed and moved to the door. Pressed her ear against wood and heard nothing. She tried the handle, locked from outside. Understanding crashed through her like ice water. This wasn't random. This was the move. The conspiracy Vaelor had tried to prevent with threats and promises. They'd waited until he was too far away to stop them. And now they were coming. A third contraction hit, stronger than the others. Seris doubled over, one hand pressed to her belly, the other bracing against the wall. The 6 heartbeats inside her seemed to stutter. "No," she whispered. "Not now. Not like this." But her body wasn't listening. The stress of months, the constant fear, the weight of carrying 6 lives, all of it was crashing down at the worst possible moment. She heard footsteps in the corridor, heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with purpose toward her door. Seris looked around desperately for weapons and found nothing. The room had been stripped of anything she could use to defend herself. Even the fire poker was gone. They'd planned this carefully. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A key turned in the lock. And as the door began to open, revealing shadows and steel and the familiar scarred face of Kael, the hunter who'd chased her across winter, Seris understood with perfect clarity that Vaelor's gamble had failed. The door swung wide. Kael stepped through, blade in hand, murder in his eyes. "Hello, abomination," he said. "Time to finish what we started." Behind him, palace guards stood watching, not intervening, not helping, complicit. Seris backed toward the window, her mind racing, pain tearing through her belly as contractions built. And somewhere far away, in a border camp surrounded by war, Vaelor Draven felt something cold settle into his chest without understanding why. The sensation of absolute wrongness. The knowledge, bone deep and certain, that he'd made a terrible mistake. That somewhere, the woman carrying 6 pieces of his impossible future was running out of time. And he was too far away to save her. Kael moved into the room like death had learned to walk. The hunter who'd chased Seris across winter, who'd stood at the boundary stones and promised her end, now crossed the threshold with a blade that caught torchlight and turned it into promises of blood. Behind him, palace guards stood frozen in the doorway. Not helping, not intervening, just watching with the dead eyes of men who'd already made their choice. Seris backed toward the window, her hand pressed against her belly, where 6 heartbeats hammered in panic. Another contraction tore through her, stealing breath, but she forced herself to stay upright, stay present, because the moment she went down, she was finished. "How much did they pay you?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Kael smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd been waiting months for this moment. "Enough," he said. "But honestly, I'd have done this for free. You're an abomination. Those things you're carrying are abominations. The clans were right to exile you. The king was wrong to protect you." He took another step forward. "And now we're correcting his mistake." The guards in the doorway shifted. One of them, younger than the others, looked sick. But he didn't move to help, didn't raise his voice, just stood there and let it happen. That's what broke Seris's heart more than the blade or the hunter or even the contractions tearing through her body. Not the enemies at her throat, but the ones who'd sworn to protect her and chosen complicity instead. Because here's the truth about power that nobody wants to acknowledge. It's not the ones who actively destroy you that hurt worst. It's the ones who stand aside and let it happen. The ones who could intervene but calculate that their comfort matters more than your survival. They're the real architects of cruelty, those silent witnesses who make violence possible through their refusal to act. Seris had learned that lesson in exile, had watched entire villages close their gates while she bled in the snow, had seen people who claimed compassion turn their backs rather than risk association with her curse. She'd hoped the palace would be different. She'd been wrong. Kael lunged. Seris threw herself sideways, her pregnant body moving with desperate instinct. The blade missed her throat by inches and buried itself in the wall where her head had been. She grabbed a ceramic water pitcher from the bedside table and swung it with everything she had. It shattered against Kael's temple. The hunter staggered, blood streaming down his face, more surprised than hurt. Seris didn't wait. She ran for the door, pushing past guards who made token efforts to block her, but not enough to actually stop her. They wanted her dead, but they didn't want to be the ones who killed her. Wanted the conspiracy to succeed while keeping their hands clean. Cowards. All of them. She made it 3 steps into the corridor before Kael caught her. His hand closed around her hair and yanked her backward. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat like broken glass. He slammed her against the wall hard enough to rattle her teeth. The impact sent shock waves through her belly. The 6 heartbeats inside her stuttered. "No," she gasped. "Please, no." But biology doesn't negotiate. Stress and violence were pushing her body past its limits. She felt wetness between her legs and knew with sickening certainty that this was labor beginning. Not the gentle progression healers talked about, but the brutal emergency kind, the kind that killed mothers and children both. Kael raised his blade. "Any last words, abomination?" Seris met his eyes. "The king will burn you all." "Probably," Kael agreed, "but you won't be alive to see it." The blade descended. Then the corridor exploded in silver fire. Kael flew backward like he'd been hit by a charging bull. He slammed into the opposite wall hard enough to crack stone, his blade clattering away across marble floors. The guards scattered, some running, others dropping to their knees with hands raised in surrender. Seris slid down the wall, her vision swimming, trying to understand what had just happened. The palace wards had activated. Not the old ones designed to suppress and control, but Vaelor's rebuilt protections. The ones woven around her specifically, keyed to her life and the lives she carried. They'd been dormant, waiting, and violence had finally triggered them. Silver light pulsed through the walls like veins of liquid moonlight. The corridor itself seemed alive, aware, furious at the violation happening within its boundaries. Kael struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and confusion. "What the hell is this?" "Protection," a voice said from the end of the corridor. "The kind you can't buy, or threaten, or wait out." Merrin stepped into view, flanked by a dozen guards wearing different insignia than the ones who'd stood aside. These were the king's personal detail, the wolves who answered to Vaelor alone and nobody else. The king's advisor looked at the scene with cold assessment. Seris bleeding against the wall. Kael with murder still written across his face. The complicit guards frozen between fight and flight. Her expression went absolutely glacial. "Interesting," she said quietly. "I wondered who'd move first. Looks like you saved me the trouble of identifying the traitors." She gestured, and the loyal guards surged forward. They had Kael in chains within seconds, disarming him with brutal efficiency. The palace guards who'd enabled the attack tried to run, but didn't make it 5 steps before they were tackled and restrained. Merrin crossed to Seris and knelt beside her. "Can you stand?" Seris tried. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. Another contraction hit, and she doubled over, gasping. "The children," she managed. "Something's wrong." Merrin's jaw tightened. She turned to the nearest guard. "Get the healers. Now. Full emergency response. Move." He ran. The advisor looked back at Seris, and for the first time since they'd met, something like genuine concern crossed her face. "You're going into labor. Too early," Seris gasped. "Too much stress. They're not ready." "Neither are we," Merrin said grimly, "but that's never stopped anything from happening." She helped Seris to her feet, supporting her weight, and together they moved toward the rebuilt birthing chamber. Behind them, silver fire still pulsed through the walls, the palace's fury at the attempted murder radiating through stone and steel. And in a border camp 3 weeks away, Vaelor Draven woke from nightmare with ice in his chest and certainty in his bones that everything had just gone catastrophically wrong. The birthing chamber blazed with silver light and desperate activity. Healers swarmed Seris the moment Maren got her through the doors, their hands glowing with medicinal magic as they assessed damage and tried to slow labor that had already gained momentum. Blood soaked through blankets. Seris's screams echoed off rebuilt walls. "It's too early," the head healer said, her voice tight with controlled panic. 7 months. Maybe 7.5. The children aren't fully developed. If we can't stop this, the smaller ones won't survive. "Then stop it," Maren commanded. "We're trying," the healer snapped back. But her body's in shock. The stress, the violence, it triggered cascade failure. Everything's happening too fast. Another contraction tore through Seris and she arched off the bed, her hand scrabbling for something to hold on to. A younger healer grabbed it, squeezing tight, whispering reassurances that meant nothing against the tidal wave of pain. Through the agony, Seris heard voices arguing. The wards are destabilizing. They're tied to her life force, and right now that's fluctuating wildly. Can we sever the connection? Not without killing her. The king specifically designed them to be inseparable from the 6 heartbeats. He wanted absolute protection. Well, it's backfiring. The more distressed she gets, the more volatile the wards become. We're one spike away from this entire wing exploding. Then sedate her. We can't. The medications that would calm her enough might stop the children's hearts. Seris tried to focus through the pain and confusion, but her mind was fragmenting. She caught glimpses of the healers working over her, felt hands pressing against her belly, trying to assess position and readiness. Heard the steady hammer of 6 heartbeats that were growing more erratic by the minute. One of the children was in distress. She could feel it, a wrongness in the rhythm. "Something's failing," she gasped. One of them. Northwest position. The healers exchanged glances. The head healer pressed her hands against Seris's belly and went very still, concentrating. After a moment, her face went pale. "She's right. The smallest one. Heart rate dropping. If we don't deliver soon, we'll lose it." "Then deliver," Maren said. "It's too early," the healer repeated. "The survival rate for a 7-month silver litter is almost non-existent. We're talking about 6 premature children fighting for resources in a womb that's already compromised. Even if we get them out alive, keeping them alive is another matter entirely. So what do you recommend?" Maren's voice had gone dangerously quiet. The healer met her eyes. "We try to save the mother. Use emergency spells to stop the labor, terminate the pregnancy, and give Seris a chance to survive." The room fell silent except for Seris's ragged breathing. Maren turned to look at her. "It's your choice," she said quietly. "You heard the options. Fight to deliver and possibly lose them all, including yourself. Or end it now and live." Seris stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down her face, her mind screaming against the impossible choice. This was the moment. The edge where survival instinct met commitment, where she had to decide whether her life mattered more than the 6 lives depending on her, or whether conviction ran deeper than self-preservation. She thought about Dain, dead before he could see what they'd created together. Thought about winter and exile and the long bloody road that had led her to this palace. Thought about Vaelor kneeling in snow, listening to heartbeats nobody else believed existed. And she thought about what kind of world awaited children born to a mother who chose herself over them when the stakes got real. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Deliver them." "Seris?" "All of them," she said louder. "I don't care about the odds. I don't care about survival rates. We deliver all 6 or we die trying." The head healer looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to talk sense and statistics and cold medical reality. But something in Seris's expression stopped her. Instead, she just nodded. "Prepare for emergency delivery," she called to her team. "Full spectrum support. And someone send word to the king. If he wants to see these children alive, he needs to ride faster than he's ever ridden in his life." But Vaelor was 3 weeks away, and the first child was already crowning. The siege began 40 minutes later. Seris was deep in the hell of labor, too consumed by pain to register when the first screams echoed through the palace corridors, too far gone to hear the clash of steel on steel or the howling of wolves that didn't belong inside these walls. But Maren heard. She stood at the birthing chamber entrance, watching healers work, and felt the palace shudder under assault, felt the wards flare and surge as violence spread through halls like infection. One of the loyal guards appeared, blood streaming from a gash across his shoulder. My lady, we're under attack. The gates open from inside. Black wolves, mercenaries. They're slaughtering their way toward this chamber. Marin's expression went cold as winter. How many? At least 50. Maybe more. They knew exactly which gates to target, which guards to bribe. This was planned. Of course it was, Marin said. Kill the woman during childbirth when the king's too far away to intervene and blame it on complications. Clean. Efficient. She turned to assess the situation. The birthing chamber had one entrance and no other exits. Defensible, but also a trap if they got overwhelmed. The healers couldn't be moved, not with Seris in active labor, which meant they had to hold this position until either Vaelor arrived or the children were born and they could evacuate. How long can you hold the corridor? She asked the guard. He looked at the dozen men he'd brought with him, then at the sounds of battle getting closer. 10 minutes, he said honestly. Maybe 15 if we're lucky. Make it 20, Marin ordered. I don't care how. Use the wards. Use the furniture. Stack bodies if you have to. But nothing gets through that door. The guards saluted and ran back toward the fighting. Marin looked at the healers. How long until delivery? First child is crowning, one of them said without looking up. Could be minutes, could be an hour. Labor doesn't follow schedules. Make it faster. We're doing everything we can. Do more. Behind her, Seris screamed as another contraction hit. The sound was primal, stripped of everything human except the will to survive. And outside, the killing intensified. The loyal guards formed a wall of steel across the corridor, shields locked, blades ready. When the first wave of mercenaries hit, the clash was deafening. Metal shrieked, men shouted, blood painted marble floors. The guards held, barely. The mercenaries were professionals, wolves who killed for gold and asked no questions about morality. They came in waves, testing defenses, probing for weakness. Every time the guards drove them back, more appeared. Someone had paid a fortune for this assault. Inside the birthing chamber, the first child entered the world. She came out silent, small enough to fit in 2 hands, her skin translucent and slick with birth fluids. The healer caught her with practiced efficiency and immediately began emergency breathing support. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the child gasped, coughed, drew her first breath. The healer's face flooded with relief. First one's alive, she announced. Small, but viable. 5 more, another healer said grimly, already working to help the next child along. Seris barely heard them. She was too far into the dark place where pain became the entire universe. But somewhere beneath the agony, she felt triumph. 1 child had survived. Now they just had to save 5 more while the palace burned around them. Lord Malrek watched the assault from a tower window overlooking the chaos. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The gates had opened. The mercenaries had penetrated deep into the palace. The loyal guards were overwhelmed and dying. And in the birthing chamber, Seris Vale was either delivering children who'd die within minutes or dying herself trying. Either outcome served his purposes. Lady Ashrin stood beside him, her face pale but determined. "When will you stop this?" she asked quietly. "When she's dead," Malrek said. "When those abominations are dead. When we can present the king with an accomplished fact and dare him to retaliate." "He will," Ashrin said. "You know he will. Vaelor will burn us all." Malrek smiled. "Vaelor will grieve, rage, make threats, but ultimately he'll recognize reality. We're the kingdom's foundation. The noble houses that finance his armies, manage his territories, maintain order. He can't destroy us without destroying everything he's built." He turned from the window. Kings are only as strong as the system supporting them. And right now the system is telling him that tradition matters more than innovation, that stability requires sacrifice. He'll understand. Eventually. And if he doesn't? Then we find a new king, Malrek said simply. One who remembers his place. They stood in silence, listening to distant screams and the clash of battle. Neither of them noticed the figure approaching from behind until a blade pressed against Malrek's throat. "Interesting theory," Marin said, her voice colder than ice. "Want to test it?" Malrek froze. Ashrin gasped and stepped back. The king's advisor held the patriarch of the Vae bloodline with the casual competence of someone who'd killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "Did you really think I wouldn't know?" Marin asked conversationally. That I wouldn't have spies watching the very nobles most likely to rebel? I've been tracking your conspiracy since before the king left. Then why didn't you stop us? Malric managed. Because I needed to know how deep the rot went, Meryn said. Needed to see who'd act and who'd stay loyal when actually tested. Congratulations. You provided excellent data. She increased pressure on the blade. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to send word to call off those mercenaries, right now, or I'm going to open your throat and let you bleed out while watching your house burn. You wouldn't dare, Malric said. Kill me and you make a martyr. The other houses will fall in line once they see what happens to traitors, Meryn interrupted. You're not special, Malric. You're not irreplaceable. You're just another noble who forgot that crowns don't beg permission. She pulled a horn from her belt and pressed it into his hand. Signal the retreat. 3 short blasts. Do it now. Malric's hand shook. He looked at Lady Ashrin, seeking support, and found only fear. He lifted the horn, blew 3 short blasts. The sound carried across the palace, cutting through combat. Seconds later, the mercenaries began withdrawing, not fleeing, but pulling back in organized retreat. They'd been paid to kill, but not to die for it. The loyal guards let them go, too exhausted and bloodied to give chase. Meryn lowered her blade but didn't sheath it. You're under arrest, she told Malric. Treason. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted assassination of the king's protected. When Vaelor returns, you'll stand trial. And we both know how that ends. She gestured, and guards appeared from the stairwell, moving to restrain both conspirators. As they dragged Malric away, he looked back at Meryn. You think you've won, he said. But you haven't. Even if those children survive, even if the king protects them, the kingdom will never accept them. We'll fight this change until it breaks us or breaks him. Meryn's expression didn't change. Then you'll break, she said simply. Because Vaelor doesn't compromise. He doesn't negotiate. He just becomes more of what you're afraid of until you either bend or shatter. She watched them disappear down the stairs. Then she ran toward the birthing chamber. The second child arrived 12 minutes after the first, then the third, then complications. The fourth child was breech, positioned wrong, and the healers had to manually reposition it while Seris screamed herself hoarse. Blood loss was becoming critical. Her body was shutting down from exhaustion and trauma. We're losing her, one healer said. Keep her conscious, the head healer commanded. If she passes out, her body will stop fighting. They slapped cold water on Seris's face, forced her to breathe, shouted her name until she surfaced from the darkness trying to claim her. Stay with us, they demanded. 3 more. You can do this. But Seris wasn't sure she could. Every contraction felt like dying. Her vision kept graying at the edges. She could feel her heartbeat becoming irregular, feel her body making the cold calculation that saving the mother meant abandoning the children. She refused. Somewhere in the exhausted wreckage of her mind, she found Diane's memory, found winter and exile and every moment she'd survived when survival seemed impossible, found Vaelor kneeling in snow, counting heartbeats nobody believed existed, and she pushed. The fourth child came free, stillborn. The healer worked frantically, clearing airways, stimulating breath. For terrible seconds, nothing happened. Then a weak cry. Alive, the healer gasped, barely, but alive. 2 more, another healer said. Come on, Seris, 2 more. But Seris was beyond language now, beyond thought. She existed only in the narrow space between contractions, fighting to stay conscious long enough to finish what she'd started. The 5th child took forever. Minutes stretched into eternities. The healers debated emergency intervention, debated cutting Seris open to save time. But the head healer refused. Her body knows what to do, she said. We just have to give it time. We don't have time, someone argued. Look at the blood loss. Then work faster. The 5th child arrived in a rush of fluid and relief. Another girl. Breathing, small but fierce. 1 more, the head healer said, and her voice carried desperate hope. Just 1 more, Seris, the smallest one, the one who started all this. Bring her home. But the 6th child didn't want to come. She was positioned wrong, tangled in cord, her heartbeat barely detectable. The healers tried everything. Spells, physical manipulation, desperate prayers to forces they claimed not to believe in. Nothing worked. Seris felt the life inside her fading, felt the sixth heartbeat stuttering toward silence. "No," she whispered, "not after everything, not after all of this." She gathered the last fragments of strength her body possessed and pushed with everything she had. The sixth child came free in a gush of blood. Silent, unmoving. The healer caught her and immediately began emergency resuscitation, cleared airways, stimulated breathing, poured healing magic into the tiny body. Nothing. "Come on," the healer begged. "Come on, little one. Fight." Still nothing. Seris watched from the edge of consciousness as they worked over her smallest child, watched the healer's movements become more frantic, more desperate, watched hope die in professional eyes. Then the palace wards pulsed. Silver light exploded through the birthing chamber, brighter than anything that had come before. It converged on the sixth child, wrapping her in radiance that seemed to come from the stone itself. The child gasped, drew breath, screamed with a fury that announced she'd fought death itself and won. The healers stared in shocked silence, then erupted in cheers. "6 children," the head healer said, her voice shaking, "all alive, all breathing." She looked at Seris with something like awe. "You did it. Against every odd, every statistic, every law of medicine. You brought them all through." Seris tried to respond, tried to ask if they were healthy, if they'd survive. But darkness rose up and claimed her. Her last thought before unconsciousness was a prayer that Vaelor would arrive in time to see what they'd created, that he'd keep his promise, that he'd protect these 6 impossible lives she'd just traded her own to deliver. Then nothing. Vaelor reached the palace gates 3 days later. He'd ridden without stopping, pushing horses to collapse and beyond, abandoning his army to follow at whatever pace they could manage. The moment he'd felt wrongness in his chest, the certainty that Seris was in danger, he'd known staying at the borders was suicide. So he'd gambled everything on speed. The palace that greeted him looked like a war zone. Blood stained the courtyards. Broken weapons littered the grounds. Bodies had been cleared, but the signs of violence remained everywhere, carved into stone and painted across marble. Meryn met him in the main hall. "She's alive," the advisor said before he could ask. "Barely. Touch and go for the first 2 days. But the healers pulled her through. And the children? All 6, Meryn said, and even her controlled expression couldn't hide the wonder. All 6 survived. 3 boys, 3 girls. Premature and fragile, but breathing. Vaelor felt something in his chest unlock, relief so profound it was almost painful. "Where is she?" "The birthing chamber. She's been unconscious since delivery. Her body shut down from the trauma. They're not sure when she'll wake." He moved past Meryn without another word, taking stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering against ribs. The birthing chamber was dim and quiet when he entered. Seris lay on the bed, pale as death, so still she barely looked alive. Around her, in 6 small bassinets woven with protective wards, the children slept. Vaelor approached slowly, like he was approaching something sacred. He looked at Seris first, at the woman who'd crossed winter and survived exile, and endured assassination and delivered 6 children while the palace burned. Her face was gaunt, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. Then he turned to the bassinets. 6 children, each one impossibly small, each one breathing. He moved from bassinet to bassinet, studying them with the focus of a general assessing troops, looking for signs of strength, of viability, of the fierce will to survive that their mother had shown. And he found it, in the way the largest boy's hands curled into fists even in sleep, in the defiant set of the smallest girl's jaw, in the steady rhythm of 6 heartbeats that refused to quit. These were survivors. His survivors. Behind him, Meryn entered quietly. "Lord Malrek and Lady Ashrin are in the dungeons," she reported, along with 17 other nobles, 43 guards, and the mercenary captain who led the assault. "They're all waiting for your judgment." Vaelor didn't turn around. "How bad was the betrayal?" Meryn's voice was carefully neutral. "Worse than we thought. The conspiracy ran deep. Multiple noble houses, sections of the guard, even some servants. They waited until you were gone, then tried to kill her during labor when she'd be most vulnerable." She paused. "If the wards hadn't activated, if I hadn't gotten there in time, we'd be having a very different conversation." "But you did," Vaelor said. "And she survived, and the children survived. He finally turned to face his advisor. Which means now we send a message. Marin nodded slowly. What kind of message? The kind that makes very clear what happens when you touch what's mine, Vaelor said, and his voice carried the cold fury of winter itself. He moved toward the door, then stopped. When she wakes, tell her I kept my promise. Tell her the children are safe. And tell her that before this weekend's, every person who moved against her will understand exactly why you don't bet against the Iron Crown. He left the birthing chamber with ice in his eyes and murder in his heart. And 3 days later, when the executions began, they were brutal enough that people would still be telling horror stories about them 400 years later. Just as he'd promised. The executions began at dawn. Vaelor had them staged in the central courtyard, where every window in the palace could provide a view, where every servant, every guard, every noble still breathing could bear witness to what happened when you mistook his mercy for weakness. Lord Malrek Vey was brought out first. The patriarch who'd orchestrated conspiracy looked smaller in chains than he had in silks. His face was bruised from 3 days in the dungeons. His hands shook, but his eyes still held defiance, the stubborn conviction of a man who believed tradition would vindicate him, even in death. Vaelor stood on the execution platform in full ceremonial armor, the iron crown catching early light and turning it into accusations. He looked at Malrek the way a wolf looks at prey that's already dead, but doesn't know it yet. "Any last words?" the king asked. Malrek straightened as much as his chains allowed. "History will judge you," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "You're destroying everything this kingdom was built on, everything that kept us strong for 4 centuries. Future generations will call you mad." Vaelor's expression didn't change. "Future generations will call me the king who chose evolution over extinction," he said, who understood that tradition is just another word for the fear of change. "But you're right about one thing. History will absolutely judge this moment." He gestured to the executioner. "Make it clean." The blade fell. Malrek's head hit the platform with a sound that echoed like thunder, and the nobles watching from windows understood with perfect clarity that everything had changed. Because here's the truth about power that separates kings from pretenders. It's not about who can be most brutal. Any thug with a blade can kill. Real power is about demonstrating that your conviction runs deeper than everyone else's comfort, that you're willing to burn the entire world before you compromise on what matters. Vaelor had just proven he was that kind of king. Lady Ashrin came next. Then the guards who'd stood aside and let Kael attack Seris. Then the servants who'd cut bell cords and locked doors. One by one, the conspirators were brought forward. One by one, the king pronounced judgment. Some begged, some confessed. Some went to their deaths cursing him. He showed them all the same mercy they'd shown Seris. None. By midday, 17 heads decorated pikes along the palace walls. The nobles who'd survived, the ones who'd known about the conspiracy but hadn't acted, stood in enforced attendance and felt their bowels turn to water. They understood now. The line Vaelor had drawn wasn't theoretical, it was literal, written in blood. When the last execution finished, the king stood before the assembled court and spoke. "Let me be absolutely clear about what just happened," he said. "I didn't kill these people for failing. I killed them for choosing comfort over courage, for deciding that their fear of change was worth more than innocent lives." He looked across the crowd. "Some of you watched it happen, knew what was being planned, and said nothing. You're alive because you didn't actively participate. But understand this. Your silence was complicity. Your neutrality was cowardice. And I remember cowards." He paused. "The Iron Crown is evolving. 6 children were born in this palace, despite every obstacle tradition could throw at them. They survived because their mother was stronger than your hatred. Because I was willing to gamble everything you hold sacred on a future you're too afraid to imagine." His voice hardened. "And if you think their birth changes anything about my expectations, you're wrong. Those children will be raised here, educated here, protected here, and when they're old enough, they will take their place in this kingdom's leadership, whether you like it or not." He descended from the platform. "Anyone who has a problem with that knows where to find me. But come with a blade, not complaints, because I'm done negotiating with people who mistake patience for permission." He left the courtyard in silence so complete it felt like the palace itself was holding its breath. And somewhere in the rebuilt birthing chamber, Seris finally opened her eyes. She woke to silver light and the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. For a moment, Seris couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. Her body felt like it had been torn apart and reassembled wrong. Everything hurt. Her throat was raw from screaming. Her belly felt empty in a way that triggered immediate panic. The children. She tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through her. A hand pressed gently against her shoulder, easing her back down. "Don't move," a healer said. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Your body needs rest." "Where are they?" Seris's voice came out as a croak. "The children, are they—" "Alive," the healer said, and her smile was genuine. "All 6. Against every odd, every medical prediction, all 6 survived." She gestured to the bassinets arranged around the bed. "See for yourself." Seris turned her head, moving slowly because even that small motion sent waves of agony through her body. And there they were. 6 small shapes wrapped in blankets, each one breathing, each one real. She started crying and couldn't stop. Not from sadness, from relief so profound it was indistinguishable from pain. She'd done it, survived winter and exile and assassination and labor that should have killed her, brought 6 impossible lives into a world that wanted them dead. And they were breathing. "Can I hold them?" she asked. The healer hesitated. "You're still very weak. The blood loss was severe. We almost lost you twice." "I don't care," Seris said. "Please." The healer relented. She lifted the nearest child, a girl, the smallest one, and placed her carefully in Seris's arms. The weight was nothing, maybe 5 pounds, fragile as glass. But when those tiny eyes opened and fixed on Seris's face, something inside her chest cracked open. "Hello," she whispered. "I'm your mother, and you're the fiercest thing I've ever seen." The child made a small sound, not quite a cry, but close. "What are their names?" Seris asked. The healer smiled. "The king said you get to choose, but he suggested you might want to wait until you were conscious to decide." Just then the door opened. Vaelor entered like winter itself had learned to walk. He was still wearing the ceremonial armor from the execution, still had blood on his boots from the courtyard. His face was carved from stone, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from doing terrible things for necessary reasons. He stopped when he saw Seris awake. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vaelor crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, bringing himself level with her despite the crown on his head and the authority radiating from every scar. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was rough. "So are they," Seris replied, looking down at the child in her arms. Vaelor's gaze followed hers. He reached out slowly, like he was afraid touching the baby would break her, and brushed one finger against her cheek. "The smallest one," he said. "The one who almost didn't make it. She's a fighter, like her mother." Seris met his eyes. "I heard the executions," she said quietly. 17 sets of footsteps. 17 times the blade fell. Vaelor's expression didn't change. 18, he corrected. The mercenary captain was last. I wanted him to watch what happened to everyone who'd hired him before he joined them. "Good," Seris said, and meant it. The healer made a small sound of disapproval but said nothing. Vaelor stood and moved to the bassinets, studying each child with the same focus he probably used to study battle plans, looking for weaknesses, assessing viability, measuring survival odds. "They're small," he finally said. "They're 7 months premature," the healer replied. "It's a miracle they're alive at all." "How small?" Vaelor asked. "The largest is 6 pounds. The smallest is 4.5. They'll need constant care for months. Special feeding, warmth, protection from infection. Even with our best efforts, we might still lose 1 or more before their first year." "We won't," Seris said, and her voice carried absolute conviction. Vaelor looked at her. "No," he agreed. "We won't." He moved back to her bedside. "I kept my promise," he said. "They're safe, protected, and everyone who moved against you is dead or wishing they were. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Vaelor said. "The execution solved the immediate problem but created a dozen more. Half the noble houses are terrified. The other half are furious. The court is fracturing, and we still have 6 premature children who need to survive long enough to justify everything I just destroyed. So what do? We adapt," Vaelor said. "Again." We rebuild around the new reality instead of trying to force reality to fit old structures. He paused. And we name them. Give them identities that the kingdom can't ignore. Seris looked down at the children. Aurelia, she said, touching the smallest one, for the girl who fought death itself. Vaelor nodded. The boys? Kael, she said, and felt bitter irony in using her dead mate's name. Theros, Rowan, and the other girls? Celine, Lunara, 6 names for 6 futures. Vaelor tested them out loud, tasting each one, measuring how they'd sound in throne rooms and battlefields and histories yet to be written. They'll do, he finally said. Strong names, names that announce they belong here. He looked at Seris. Can you walk? Barely. Why? Because tomorrow I'm presenting them to the full court, officially naming them as crown-born heirs with all rights and protections that entails. And I want you standing beside me when I do it. I just gave birth 3 days ago, Seris said, to 6 children, while being assassinated. I know, Vaelor said, which is exactly why you need to be there, so everyone can see what it takes to break you and understand they don't have it. That's cruel. That's survival, Vaelor corrected. The moment you show weakness, they'll exploit it. So we show strength instead, overwhelming, undeniable strength. Seris wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she'd earned rest, that she'd given enough, that surely 3 days of unconsciousness and 18 executions bought her at least a week of recovery. But she understood what he wasn't saying. This was the critical moment, the point where they either consolidated their victory or lost everything. The nobles were reeling from the executions, terrified and furious, and looking for any sign that the king's resolve was weakening. If Seris appeared broken, if she seemed like a victim who'd barely survived, it would validate every doubt about whether the children were worth the cost. But if she appeared strong, if she stood beside Vaelor and presented 6 living children as proof that conviction could defeat tradition, it would cement everything. She met his eyes. Help me up, she said. The healer protested. Vaelor overruled her. Together, they got Seris on her feet. Her legs shook, her vision grayed. But she stayed upright through sheer stubborn will. Tomorrow, Vaelor said. Full court assembly. You, me, and 6 futures that are going to reshape this kingdom, whether it wants to be reshaped or not. He moved toward the door, then paused. And Seris? One more thing, yes? The king's expression softened fractionally. You were right, he said. About them. About the gamble. About everything. I'm glad I listened. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with 6 sleeping children and the weight of futures pressing against her chest. The night before the presentation, Seris couldn't sleep. She lay in the rebuilt chamber surrounded by bassinets and guards, and the gentle breathing of children who had no idea they were weapons in a war they hadn't chosen. Her body ached, her mind raced, and somewhere beneath exhaustion and fear, she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous. Not love. Not yet. She'd learned long ago that love required safety to flourish, and safety was something she'd never possessed. But maybe the foundation for it. The recognition that she and Vaelor were fighting the same battle from different positions, both trying to protect futures that tradition wanted destroyed, both willing to burn the world rather than surrender what mattered. She thought about the executions. 18 people dead because they'd tried to kill her. 18 heads on pikes because Vaelor had drawn a line and enforced it with blood. Some part of her knew she should feel guilt, horror, revulsion at the violence committed in her name. But she didn't. She felt vindicated. Because here's the truth about survival that nobody admits aloud. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become what others fear. Sometimes conviction requires cruelty. Sometimes the difference between victim and victor is just willingness to go further than your enemies thought possible. Seris had crossed that line in the snow months ago when she'd chosen to keep running instead of giving up. Had crossed it again in the birthing chamber when she'd chosen to deliver all 6 children knowing it might kill her. And Vaelor had crossed it on the execution platform when he'd put 18 heads on pikes and told the kingdom to accept change or join them. They were both monsters now, by any traditional measure. But they were monsters who'd kept 6 children breathing, who'd torn down centuries of tradition because tradition was just another word for comfortable oppression. And Seris found she could live with that. Marin appeared in the doorway near midnight. Can't sleep? the advisor asked. Not even close. Merrin entered and settled into a chair near the bed. Nervous about tomorrow? Terrified, Seris admitted. I can barely walk. My body feels like it's held together with spite and stubbornness. And you want me to stand before the entire court and present 6 premature children as the future of the kingdom. That's exactly what we want, Merrin said. Because if you can do that, if you can stand there broken and bleeding and still project strength, it will break something inside the nobles watching. They'll understand that you're not going away, that those children aren't a mistake to be corrected, but a reality to be accepted. And if I collapse, if my body gives out halfway through, then we carry you out and spin it as exhaustion from defending your children during the siege, Merrin said pragmatically. Everything can be used. The question is whether you're willing to be used. Seris looked at the 6 bassinets. For them? Yes. Good, Merrin said, because tomorrow determines everything. If we succeed, the children are legitimized. If we fail, we're fighting this same battle for the next 20 years. She stood to leave, then paused. Can I give you advice? You're going to whether I want it or not. Merrin smiled slightly. When you're standing up there tomorrow, when you're presenting those children, don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't justify. Just exist. Let them see what it takes to survive what you survived. Let them wonder if they have it. That's terrifying. That's power, Merrin corrected. The kind that doesn't need armies or crowns. Just the absolute certainty that you'll outlast whatever they throw at you. She left Seris alone with that thought, and when dawn came, Seris forced herself out of bed and prepared to prove it. Chatte. The throne room was packed tighter than it had been for the executions. Every noble who could walk had come. Every guard. Every servant with enough rank to justify attendance. They filled the space like spectators at a gladiator match, waiting to see if the king's madness would finally crack under the weight of reality. Seris stood in a preparation chamber, leaning heavily on a cane the healers had insisted she use, and tried not to vomit from pain and nerves. 6 handmaids attended her, dressing her in formal robes designed to hide the damage her body had sustained while projecting strength. Deep blue silk that matched the royal colors. Silver embroidery that caught light and turned it into armor. Her hair was pinned in elaborate braids that made her look regal despite the pallor and exhaustion. She looked like a queen, felt like death. The door opened and Vaelor entered. He'd eschewed the ceremonial armor for something simpler but no less commanding. Black leather and silver clasps, the iron crown sitting on his head like judgment. His eyes swept over her, assessing, measuring. Can you stand? He asked. For as long as necessary. That might be hours. Then I'll stand for hours, Seris said flatly. Vaelor's expression shifted fractionally, not quite a smile, but maybe approval. The children are already positioned, he said, 6 bassinets on the dais beside the throne. The court is waiting. When we enter, every eye will be on you, judging, measuring, looking for any sign of weakness. Then they'll be disappointed. Vaelor crossed to her and offered his arm. Walk with me, he said. Not behind me, not following. Beside me. As an equal. Seris stared at him. You're serious? Absolutely, Vaelor said. These are our children now. Not mine. Not yours. Ours. We present them together or not at all. She took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath leather and scars. Together they walked toward the throne room doors. The herald announced them with formal precision. King Vaelor Draven of the Iron Crown and Seris Vale, mother of the crown-born heirs. The doors opened. The throne room fell silent. Seris and Vaelor entered side by side, moving at a pace that accommodated her injuries without advertising them. Every step sent pain lancing through her body. Every breath felt like broken glass, but she kept her spine straight and her expression neutral and let them see nothing but strength. The crowd parted. They walked through a corridor of hostile stares and barely concealed fury. Nobles who'd lost family members to the executions. Warriors who'd served under conspirators now decorating pikes. Servants who'd been interrogated and found complicit. All of them watching, judging, waiting for her to fail. Seris looked straight ahead and refused to give them the satisfaction. They reached the dais where 6 bassinets waited. Vaelor ascended the steps and turned to face his kingdom. Seris followed, using the cane when necessary, refusing help when offered. She took her position beside the throne. The king began to speak. 3 weeks ago, he said, I left this palace to deal with border raids, orchestrated chaos designed to pull me away from what mattered. While I was gone, conspirators moved against Seris Vale with the intention of murdering her and the children she carried. His voice hardened. They failed. She survived. And 3 days ago, despite assassination attempts and premature labor and odds that should have killed everyone involved, she delivered 6 living children. He gestured to the bassinets. 6 heirs, 6 futures, 6 pieces of something this kingdom hasn't seen in 400 years. He paused. I've already executed the conspirators, 18 people who chose tradition over life. But executions only address the symptom. Today, we address the cause. Vaelor descended 1 step, bringing himself closer to the crowd. For too long, this kingdom has operated on the principle that change is weakness, that innovation threatens stability, that anything outside established patterns must be destroyed before it disrupts the comfortable order. His expression went cold. That ends now. He turned and lifted the smallest child from her bassinet. Aurelia, barely 5 pounds, wrapped in silver cloth. This is Aurelia, he announced, crown-born heir, daughter of Seris Vale. Under my direct protection and entitled to every right, privilege, and responsibility that status confers. He handed her to Seris, who held her despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, because this was the moment everything hinged on. Vaelor lifted the next child, Kael, crown-born heir, then the next, Selene, crown-born heir. One by one, he named them. One by one, Seris held them and presented them to the court. 6 impossible lives made manifest, 6 futures that tradition had tried to strangle in the womb. When all 6 had been named and shown, Vaelor addressed the crowd again. Some of you think this is madness, he said, that I'm destroying the kingdom for sentiment. Let me correct that misunderstanding. He moved to stand beside Seris. These children represent evolution, he continued. The capacity to adapt instead of repeating failed patterns. They're proof that this kingdom can grow beyond the limitations previous generations accepted as inevitable. His voice rose. And I will not apologize for protecting that. I will not compromise. I will not negotiate with people who mistake their comfort for my obligation. He let that settle. So here's your choice. Accept these 6 as crown-born heirs. Accept that the Iron Crown is changing. Accept that tradition serves us, not the other way around. He paused. Or leave. Abdicate your positions, surrender your lands and titles, walk away and build whatever fantasy kingdom you want elsewhere. But if you stay, you accept the new order, completely, without reservation. The silence was absolute. Then, from the back of the throne room, movement. A young noble, barely 20, stepped forward. My king, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I accept. The children, the change, all of it. Another noble joined him, then another, then a dozen. Not all of them, maybe half, but enough. Vaelor watched them step forward and nod. Good, he said. Welcome to the future. He turned to the ones who hadn't moved. And the rest of you? They stood frozen, caught between tradition and survival, between comfort and consequences. You have until sunset tomorrow, Vaelor said. Accept or leave. There is no middle ground. He dismissed them with a gesture. As the crowd filed out, Seris finally allowed herself to lean against the throne. Her legs were shaking, her vision was graying, but she'd done it, stood before the entire kingdom and presented 6 children as undeniable reality. Vaelor moved to support her. You need rest, he said quietly. We both do, Seris replied. He helped her back to the birthing chamber, the children carried by attendants behind them. And as they walked through corridors still stained with blood from the siege, Seris felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The bone-deep understanding that she and this brutal king were bound together now, not by sentiment, but by shared survival, by the conviction that had driven them both to gamble everything on futures nobody else believed possible, by 6 children who breathed despite every force arrayed against them. That night, with Vaelor standing guard at the door and 6 bassinets arranged around her bed, Seris finally slept and dreamed of spring. The next day brought the reckoning nobody had anticipated. Seris woke to shouting in the corridors. Not battle, not assassination, but argument. Heated debate that carried the weight of fracture. She forced herself upright, ignoring the healer's protests, and demanded to know what was happening. Marin appeared minutes later, her expression grim. "We have a problem," she said. "The nobles who didn't accept yesterday? They're not leaving quietly. They're gathering forces, calling in debts, reaching out to rival kingdoms." "Revolution?" Seris asked. "Worse," Marin said. "Civil war." Vaelor entered behind her, already dressed for battle. "How many?" he demanded. 8 houses, Marin reported. "Maybe 3,000 warriors total. They're fortifying positions in the eastern territories, claiming you violated the kingdom's foundational laws, that the children are abominations and protecting them makes you unfit to rule." Vaelor's expression went absolutely cold. "Then we remind them what happens when you challenge the Iron Crown." "You can't," Marin said. "Not now. You just executed 18 conspirators and legitimized 6 premature heirs. The kingdom is already on edge. If you march armies against your own nobles, you risk everything fracturing beyond repair." "Then what do you suggest?" Vaelor asked. "Negotiate. Find middle ground. Give them something to—" "No," Vaelor interrupted. "I'm done negotiating, done finding middle ground with people who want my children dead. They made their choice. Now they live with it." He turned to leave. Marin grabbed his arm. "If you do this, if you start a civil war over 6 children who might not survive their first year, you could lose everything. The throne, the kingdom, your life." Vaelor met her eyes. "I already lost everything the moment I chose them," he said quietly. "Now I'm just fighting to keep what I chose." He pulled free and walked toward the war room. Seris struggled out of bed and followed, her body screaming protest. She found him standing over maps, already planning assault routes and supply lines. "You're really going to do this," she said. "Start a war for them." Vaelor didn't look up. "I started a war the moment I carried you across those boundary stones," he said. "Everything since has just been delayed consequences. They're 3 days old, which makes them vulnerable," Vaelor said. "If I don't crush this rebellion now, it becomes template. Every noble with a grievance will think they can challenge me by threatening the children. So I end it. Completely. Brutally. In a way that makes very clear what happens when you touch what's mine." He finally looked at her. "Unless you're going to tell me it's not worth it." Seris met his ice-pale eyes. "I crossed winter for them," she said. "Survived exile and assassination and labor that should have killed me. You think I'm going to balk at war?" Vaelor's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something fierce and approving. "Then help me plan it," he said. And together, standing over maps with 6 children sleeping in the next room, they began plotting the systematic destruction of everyone who'd bet against their future. The civil war that would reshape the Iron Crown forever was 3 days from beginning, and neither of them had any intention of losing. The civil war lasted 6 weeks, 6 brutal weeks of fire and steel and blood soaking into frozen earth, 6 weeks of watching the kingdom tear itself apart over whether 6 children had the right to exist. 6 weeks of Vaelor proving that conviction backed by absolute ruthlessness could break anything, even tradition 4 centuries deep. The first battle happened at the eastern stronghold of House Varen, where Lord Torvin had fortified his position and called it righteous resistance. Vaelor brought 3 battalions and siege equipment built specifically to crack stone that had stood for generations. The assault lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the stronghold was rubble, and Lord Torvin's head joined the others decorating palace walls. But that was just the opening move. The rebel houses had spent decades building alliances, securing positions, cultivating power through careful political maneuvering. They thought time was on their side, thought Vaelor would hesitate, negotiate, seek compromise rather than risk destroying the kingdom's stability. They were wrong about everything. The king moved like winter itself, methodical and merciless. He didn't seek battles. He erased resistance. Entire houses were burned to foundations. Bloodlines that had ruled territories for centuries were ended in single afternoons. And every execution, every burned estate, every family driven into exile carried the same message. This is what happens when you bet against the future. Seris watched it all from the palace, still recovering from childbirth, still learning how to navigate a body that had been pushed past every limit. The healers tried to keep her confined to the birthing chamber, but she refused. She needed to see, needed to understand the price being paid in her name. The reports came daily, sometimes hourly. House Cray fell after a 3-day siege. House Malthrin surrendered without fighting and was stripped of lands but allowed to live. House Voskrin tried to flee and was hunted down on the roads. Each report was delivered with clinical precision by Meryn, who'd taken over coordinating the kingdom's response while Vaelor led armies in the field. The advisor never editorialized, never offered judgment, just presented facts and waited for Seris to process them. On the 14th day, Seris asked the question that had been building since the war began. How many dead? Meryn didn't flinch. Military casualties are around 800 on our side, maybe 2,000 among the rebels. Civilian deaths are harder to track, but estimates put them somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. She paused. The executions add another 400. Nobles, warriors, anyone who actively supported the rebellion. Seris felt her stomach turn. 5,000 people. Dead because I wouldn't end a pregnancy. Dead because they chose violence over acceptance, Meryn corrected. Dead because they couldn't stomach change. Don't mistake cause and effect. You didn't start this war, you just survived it. But the king is fighting it for me. The king is fighting it for the future, Meryn said. You and those children are just the catalyst. The excuse he needed to break systems that were already failing. She moved to the window overlooking the courtyard, where guards drilled and messengers came and went with urgent dispatches. Vaelor's been looking for this war his entire reign, the advisor continued. He spent 15 years watching noble houses accumulate power that rivaled his own, watching tradition calcify into chains, watching the kingdom stagnate because everyone was too afraid to risk what they had for what they needed. She turned back. You gave him permission to burn it all down, not because you asked for it, but because protecting you and those children required dismantling every structure that enabled the conspiracy. And once he started, there was no stopping halfway. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to help you understand what you're part of, Meryn said. This isn't about 6 children. It's about whether the Iron Crown evolves or dies. And Vaelor chose evolution, violently, completely, in a way that ensures nobody will challenge fundamental change again for generations. She paused. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you can live with that, with being the excuse for that much destruction. Seris looked at the 6 bassinets where her children slept, unaware that their existence had sparked the deadliest internal conflict the kingdom had seen in a century. And she realized something that maybe should have terrified her but didn't. She could live with it. Because here's the truth about power and survival that nobody admits in polite company. Sometimes the price of protecting what matters is accepting that others will die in the process. Sometimes conviction requires watching the world burn and knowing you provided the spark. Sometimes the difference between victim and victor is just willingness to carry the weight of consequences without breaking. Seris had learned that lesson in exile, had learned it again in the birthing chamber. And now she was learning it one more time, watching a kingdom tear itself apart. The children were alive, breathing, growing stronger every day despite premature birth and every medical prediction. Everything else was just the cost of making that possible. Vaelor returned on the 42nd day. The war wasn't over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. 5 of the 8 rebel houses had fallen. The remaining 3 were besieged and running out of supplies. It was just a matter of time before they surrendered or were crushed. The king rode through palace gates at sunset, his armor dented and blood-stained, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He dismissed his guard, climbed the stairs to the birthing chamber alone, and found Seris sitting beside the bassinets with one of the children in her arms. She looked up when he entered. They'd grown, she said quietly. In 6 weeks. Changed. Gotten stronger. Vaelor moved closer, studying the children with the focus of a man cataloging what he'd been fighting for. How many have we lost? He asked. None, Seris said, and her voice carried quiet triumph. Against every odd, all 6 are thriving. Something shifted in the king's expression, not quite relief, but maybe vindication. He crossed to the nearest bassinet and looked down at the sleeping child. Kael, the largest boy, already pushing 7 pounds. They look less fragile, Vaelor observed. The healers say they're developing faster than expected, Seris replied. Something about the silver litter genetics. They adapt, like their mother, like both their parents. Vaelor turned to face her. I heard what you did, he said. The court appearances, The negotiations with neutral houses. The speeches about the future. Marin says you basically ran the palace while I was gone. Someone had to, Seris said, and the nobles respond better to me than they do to your advisor. Something about maternal instinct being less threatening than political calculation. She stood carefully, still favoring her injured side but moving with more confidence than she'd had weeks ago. How bad was it? She asked. Out there. Vaelor was silent for a moment. Worse than I wanted, better than I feared. The rebel houses fought harder than expected. We lost good people, burned things that can't be rebuilt. He moved to the window. But we won. Completely. Decisively. In a way that makes very clear what happens when you challenge the Iron Crown over fundamental change. How many executions? 400 and counting, Vaelor said flatly. Every noble who actively supported the rebellion, every commander who led troops against us, every conspirator we could identify. Seris felt the weight of that number settle into her chest. Do you regret it? Vaelor looked at her. Every single one, he said. Regret them and would do them again without hesitation. Because the alternative was letting tradition kill 6 children and proving that fear is stronger than conviction. He paused. Regret doesn't change necessity. It just means you understand the cost. That's bleak. That's kingship, Vaelor corrected. Understanding that every choice has a body count and making the choice anyway because the alternative is worse. He turned from the window. But I didn't come here to philosophize about the price of crowns. I came to see the children. And you. Me? You, Vaelor confirmed. The woman who survived winter, an assassination, and premature labor. Who rebuilt court politics while recovering from childbirth. Who stood in front of the entire kingdom 3 days after almost dying and dared them to challenge her. He crossed to stand in front of her. You've changed, he observed. So have you. They studied each other in the fading light. 2 people who'd been strangers 6 months ago, bound together now by shared survival and 6 lives that refused to quit breathing. What happens now? Seris asked. When the war ends. When the rebel houses are crushed. What comes next? We rebuild, Vaelor said. Again. Differently this time. We create structures that serve the children instead of constraining them. We train the kingdom to accept change as strength instead of weakness. He paused. And we raise 6 heirs who understand that power is responsibility, not privilege. That crowns exist to protect futures, not preserve pasts. That's ambitious. That's necessary, Vaelor corrected. Because if we don't reshape the kingdom now, while we have the excuse and the momentum, it'll calcify again. And the next time someone challenges tradition, they'll face the same resistance we did. You're talking about generational change. I'm talking about survival, Vaelor said. The Iron Crown adapts or dies. There is no middle ground. Seris looked at the 6 bassinets. They're going to grow up knowing they sparked a civil war, she said quietly, that thousands died because they existed. How do we help them carry that? We tell them the truth, Vaelor said, that their existence revealed cracks already present in the kingdom's foundation, that the war would have come eventually regardless, just over different excuses, and that the price of living authentically is sometimes watching others fight over whether you deserve to exist. He moved closer. But we also tell them they're not responsible for other people's hatred, that they didn't ask to be born into this conflict, and that the best way to honor the cost is to build something worth what was sacrificed. That's heavy for children. They're silver litter, Vaelor said. They'll be capable of carrying heavy things. Seris met his eyes and saw the exhaustion there. The weight of 6 weeks commanding armies and ordering executions. The burden of reshaping a kingdom through blood and conviction. You need rest, she said. Later, Vaelor replied, first I need to know if we're in this together, really together. Not just convenient allies, but actual partners. Seris felt her heart stutter. What are you asking? Vaelor's expression was carefully controlled, but something vulnerable flickered behind the ice. I'm asking if you're staying, he said. If you're willing to help me raise these children and reshape this kingdom. If you can accept that being with me means carrying the weight of every choice I make, every execution I order, every war I fight. He paused. I'm asking if you can love someone who's built from scar tissue and brutal necessity, who will never be soft or easy or safe. Seris considered the question, considered the man standing before her, the brutal king who'd knelt in snow and heard 6 heartbeats, who'd torn down his ancestral palace to protect her, who'd started a civil war rather than compromise on her children's right to exist. She thought about Dain, her dead mate, and the gentle love they'd shared before winter and duty had stolen him. Thought about whether she even wanted that kind of softness anymore, or if survival had changed her into something that required different fuel. And she realized the answer was simpler than she'd expected. "I don't need soft," she said. "I need someone who won't break when the world tries to destroy what we've built. Someone who'll stand beside me when everything falls apart and fight to put it back together." She moved closer. "You're scarred and brutal and probably half mad from 15 years on a throne that demanded you sacrifice everything human. But you chose me when nobody else would. Chose 6 impossible children over 4 centuries of tradition. Started a war rather than let fear dictate the future." She took his hand. "So yes, I'm staying. I'm in this. Completely. For as long as you'll have me." Vaelor's expression cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to show the man beneath the king. He pulled her close, careful of her still healing body, and pressed his forehead against hers. "This won't be easy," he warned. "The kingdom will fight us. The children will grow up surrounded by people who resent their existence. We'll face challenges I can't predict and consequences I can't prevent." "I know," Seris said, "and I'll make mistakes. Cruel ones. I'll order things that haunt you. I'll choose the kingdom's survival over your comfort. I know that too. But I'll protect them," Vaelor said, and his voice carried absolute conviction. "Those 6 children, you, the future we're building. I'll burn the entire world before I let anyone take it." Seris smiled against his skin. "I'm counting on it." They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by sleeping children and the weight of futures pressing against them from every direction. And for the first time since crossing those boundary stones in winter, Seris felt something unfurl in her chest that she'd thought winter had killed. Not safety. She'd learned that was illusion. But maybe it's opposite. The fierce recognition that came from choosing someone not despite their sharp edges, but because of them. From finding partnership in shared survival rather than shared comfort. She kissed him. He kissed back. And somewhere in that exchange, they stopped being convenient allies and became something more dangerous. Partners. Equals. 2 people who'd chosen each other not for love but for conviction, and were learning that sometimes conviction was the stronger foundation. Well, the war ended on the 54th day. The last rebel house surrendered after a siege that had lasted 2 weeks. Lord Cregan, the final holdout, was brought before Vaelor in chains and offered a choice. Swear absolute loyalty to the new order or die with your house. Cregan looked at the king who'd spent 6 weeks systematically destroying everything that had challenged him. Looked at the pikes still decorated with the heads of nobles who'd chosen wrong. Looked at his own children standing in the courtyard, waiting to learn if their father's pride would orphan them. He knelt. "I swear," he said, his voice breaking, "absolute loyalty. To you, to the children, to whatever future you're building." Vaelor studied him for a long moment. "Then stand," he said. "You and your house are pardoned. But understand this. The moment you falter, the moment I detect hesitation or conspiracy or the slightest whisper of rebellion, I won't arrest you. I'll erase you, completely. Your name, your bloodline, every stone you ever claimed ownership of." Cregan nodded, tears streaming down his face. The king turned to address the assembled crowd. "The war is over," he announced. "The rebellion is crushed, and the kingdom stands on new foundations." He gestured to where Seris stood holding Aurelia, the smallest child, now almost 10 pounds and fierce with determination. "These are your future," Vaelor continued. 6 children born against every tradition, protected through fire and blood, legitimized by war. He paused. "Some of you will never accept them. Will spend your lives resenting what they represent. That's your right. But if you act on that resentment, if you move against them or their mother, you'll join the 400 who thought tradition was worth dying for." His voice hardened. "The Iron Crown has evolved. Accept it or leave. There are no other options." He dismissed the crowd and turned to Seris. "It's done," he said quietly. "The war or the kingdom?" "Both," Vaelor said. "We burn the old one. Now we build what comes next." Together, they walked back into the palace. Behind them, workers were already dismantling the pikes, removing the heads, cleaning blood from stone. The kingdom was being scrubbed clean of its immediate past, preparing for futures nobody could predict. 6 months later, on a morning when spring had finally broken winter's grip, Seris stood in what had been renamed the Palace of Six Moons and watched her children begin to crawl. They moved with the fierce determination of survivors, dragging themselves across polished floors toward toys and sunlight and each other. Aurelia, still the smallest, reached a wooden block first and crowed triumph. Kael followed, already competitive. The others spread out, exploring, claiming space. Vaelor entered and found her watching them with an expression somewhere between pride and terror. "They're mobile," he observed. "Completely," Seris said. "The healers say within another month they'll be walking. By their first birthday, running. Terrifying. Absolutely." He moved to stand beside her. "I've been thinking about their education," he said. "Who trains them? What they learn? How we prepare them for the weight they'll carry. They're 6 months old, which means we have maybe 10 years before they start asking difficult questions," Vaelor said. "Questions like why thousands died when they were born, why half the kingdom still resents them, why their existence required reshaping everything. So what do we tell them?" Vaelor watched the children playing. "We tell them power is responsibility," he said finally. "That crowns exist to protect those who can't protect themselves. That tradition serves people, not the other way around." He paused. "And we tell them the truth about cost, that every choice has consequences, that survival sometimes requires becoming what others fear, that conviction means carrying weight that never gets lighter." "That's harsh." "That's honest," Vaelor corrected. "I won't raise children who think power is privilege, who believe they're owed anything beyond the chance to prove themselves worthy of what was sacrificed. You're going to make them earn it. I'm going to teach them that nothing worth having comes without cost," Vaelor said. "That their lives were purchased through blood, and they honor that by building something worth the price." Seris looked at the 6 children, so small still, so unaware of the weight waiting for them. "What if they break under it?" "Then we pick them up and teach them how to carry broken things," Vaelor said. "Because that's what strength actually is, not avoiding damage, but learning how to function with scars." He turned to her. "You taught me that. In the snow. When you kept walking despite everything trying to stop you. I was terrified." "Courage is just terror that keeps moving," Vaelor said. "And you moved all the way here, survived everything, raised 6 children against impossible odds." "We raised them," Seris corrected. "This isn't my victory alone." Vaelor's expression softened fractionally. "No," he agreed. "It's ours." He pulled her close, watching their children explore the palace they'd remade. And somewhere in the rebuilt halls, in corridors scrubbed clean of blood and rebuilt around protection instead of suppression, the kingdom settled into new rhythms. The executions were over, the war had ended, the rebel houses had bent or broken, and 6 children crawled across marble floors, unaware they represented evolution itself. Change made manifest, the future that tradition had tried to strangle and failed. Years later, when those children were old enough to understand, Seris would tell them the story of winter and exile and the brutal king who'd chosen conviction over comfort. She'd tell them about the price paid in blood and bodies, about the nobles who'd died defending fear, about the kingdom that had been burned down and rebuilt. And she'd tell them that true strength wasn't avoiding difficult choices. It was making them and carrying the consequences without breaking. But that was years away. For now, she just watched them play. Watched Vaelor kneel beside Aurelia and help her stack blocks higher than she could reach alone. Watched 5 other children converge, wanting to help, wanting to build together, and felt something in her chest settle. Not peace. That was too simple for what they'd survived. But maybe its cousin. The recognition that came from choosing to live authentically in a world designed to punish difference. From finding partnership in shared survival. From building futures that honored the cost of making them possible. The kingdom would always carry scars. So would she. So would Vaelor. But scars were just proof you'd survived what tried to kill you, and survival, she'd learned, was its own form of victory. The children laughed. The spring sun warmed stone that had been soaked in winter blood. and the Palace of Six Moons stood as monument to the truth that conviction could defeat tradition if you were willing to pay the price. Seris had paid it, Vaelor had paid it, thousands had paid it, and from that brutal accounting, 6 futures had been purchased. 6 lives that refused to apologize for existing. 6 pieces of change that would reshape the kingdom whether anyone wanted reshaping or not. That night, after the children were sleeping and the palace had settled into quiet, Vaelor found Seris on the balcony overlooking the territories they'd fought to protect. "Regrets?" he asked. "Thousands," Seris admitted, "but none that would change my choices." Vaelor took her hand. "Good," he said, "because I need you to understand something. This kingdom will challenge them. Every step, every achievement. People will question their right to exist until the day they die. I know. And I can't protect them from that. Can't fight every battle. Can't erase every doubt. I know that too. But I can teach them to fight their own battles," Vaelor said. "Can give them the tools to survive what survived us. Can build a kingdom that makes space for them to become whatever they're capable of being." He paused. "If you'll help me." Seris looked at the man who'd knelt in snow and counted heartbeats, who'd torn down his palace and started a war, who'd chosen conviction over comfort and paid the price without flinching. "Always," she said, "from winter to whatever comes next." They stood together on the balcony, watching stars emerge over a kingdom remade, and somewhere below 6 children slept peacefully, breathing, thriving, alive. The future made manifest, and the crown that had chosen them over everything stood guard, scarred, and brutal, and absolutely unbreakable in its commitment to protecting what it had purchased through blood. The Iron Crown had evolved, and nothing would ever be the same.